evening. Very good, Mark. City Clerk, are we okay to begin?
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the San Bruno City Council special meeting of March the 1st at 5 o'clock. The meeting's been called to order. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Hamilton?
Here.
Councilmember Medina?
Here.
Councilmember Salazar? He is present. You might just be trying to find the mute button. Vice Mayor Mason is not present. Mayor Medina?
Here. And Mr. Salazar is present.
And I am present. Sorry about that. I couldn't find my mute button either.
So as we move on to item 3, public comments for items not on the agenda. Is there anybody from the audience, public? I'm not seeing any in our Zoom meeting. We will move on to item 4 and study session. And we have 4 items. The first item will be item A, receive report on the downtown parking meters and enhanced parking enforcement project. Turn it over to the city manager. Begin.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. Good evening to the Mayor, Council, staff, and any members of public that will join us. So first off, thank you tonight to the City Council for carving out time for this dedicated study session. We do have 4 items for tonight, all relate to the police department or projects that the police department is taking the lead on, only one of which is an action item. The other 3 are informational in nature, where we are providing the City Council with an update feedback. And so the first one is for as the Mayor mentioned, a receiver report on our downtown parking meter and parking enforcement project. Know that this is the first sort of detailed presentation to the City Council on the work that has been going on. It is nowhere near complete, and we are at a point where we thought that it was appropriate to provide you with the detailed report that was in the council packet and this presentation. There certainly will be next steps and detailed business and community engagement that will follow. And so know that, and so we're really at a point for council feedback. This presentation will be provided by Lieutenant Jane Wong. And I see Lieutenant Wong has he been brought into the room as a presenter yet? I thought I saw him as a attendee, but now I do not see him.
Yes, Lieutenant Wong is not in the attendee side.
Okay, let's, Ryan, I see your face. I think you're pinging him now.
Yeah, give me a second. I'll get him.
Okay, fair. So when Lieutenant Wong comes on, he'll give our first presentation about downtown parking meters. Then Chief Johansson will give the second item about our military use and equipment ordinance due to a new state law. We'll then receive a presentation again by Chief Johansson on a new program based on council input that the city has created that we've termed RIDOFF as a pilot program. And so we'll receive a presentation on that. And then 4D is the PD radio encryption and infrastructure project, a significant project we've talked a little bit about, but you have not received a detailed presentation on. In addition, council may not have seen, but there were a number of questions submitted earlier today that staff have provided a written response to, but feel free to, I know some of those questions will be asked tonight, but we did get together a written response, and we wanted to get that out to you, but I know council has not had time to do a detailed look at them. Lieutenant Wong, seems like you're here.
Good morning, Giovanni. Apologies. I thought it was at 6.
All right, no worries. If you can share your screen and take it away, we'll be ready.
All right, give me 1 second.
And if we can, we'll listen to the Lieutenant. hold questions until the conclusion. And Lieutenant, please, you have the floor. And do and begin with as you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mayor and Council, my name is Lieutenant Jean Wong. I'm one of the lieutenants at the police department. One of the sections I'm in charge of is the traffic section. Hopefully you guys can see my PowerPoint screen that Bruno shared. All right, so this presentation is for establishing downtown meter parking, outsourcing parking enforcement, and permit management. So the goal is to provide council with some information in this report on downtown parking meters and an enhanced parking enforcement project. We'll talk about the background, some discussion of our current efforts, a possible path forward, the fiscal impact, and recommendation alternatives. So just a little background. So basically, as we all know, in January 2019, there's a San Bruno downtown parking study was completed. Part of that parking management plan found that in their existing conditions analysis, that the current parking conditions were unacceptable to residents. Basically, population growth and housing costs have resulted in increased occupancy in the housing in the surrounding neighborhoods. So basically, in the downtown area, the demand for parking exceeds the existing supply. So part of that downtown parking study plan made a set of phased parking management recommendations to manage the parking in the downtown area, including the high afternoon and evening parking demand timeframes, and to help users find and use available parking, improve parking availability for residents, and potentially increase the parking supply. So some of the recommendations of the plan included adjusting enforcement hours to better manage the heavy use evening period, typically the dinner time hours. The plan called for adjusting time restrictions, primarily to convert 5-hour spaces to 10-hour spaces for employees and businesses. One of the recommendations was to improve signage to help drivers locate available parking. All the city lots are typically off of San Mateo Avenue, behind the businesses. The plan also called for installing parking meters on San Mateo Avenue to encourage short-time parking there and to direct long-term parking into the city lots. The plan also called to formalize overnight parking arrangements in the public lots to increase the supply available to residents. So our current efforts, we're limited in our staff hours to conduct proactive parking enforcement. So the traffic section of the police department is responsible for parking enforcement. The section has 2 full-time employees and 3 part-time community service officers. The community service officers that are part-time can only work 2 hours, 2 days per week based on limitations from PERS. The section 1 fully staffed typically has 3 community service officers working each weekday, and typically after 2:30 p.m. there aren't any CSOs available. So our community service officers, again, are in charge of parking enforcement. Some of their ongoing parking duties include street sweeping on the 1st and 3rd weeks of the month. So for large parts of those days, they have to stay ahead of the street sweepers on a fixed route to conduct street sweeping enforcement. Part of their parking enforcement duties includes 72-hour parking investigations, which take up a large amount of their staff hours. As an example, in 2019, there were 2,735 reported 72-hour parking violations. So that's an average of 10 new complaints a day that the CSOs have to go and find and process. That's not including the probably about 10 that are ready to research and cite if they are still parked in place that they chalked or marked previously. So that takes up a majority of their time. Parking enforcement is a significant duty for our community service officers. It's not the only thing they do. They have many other critical duties, which are crucial for the operation of the police department. So our community service officers, they take cold crime reports. Basically, if it's not something that's high risk, there's no suspect information, our community service officers will take cold crime reports, which frees up time for our sworn police officers to do other things and other enforcement. Our CSOs also take non-injury traffic collision reports. Again, that frees up time for our sworn officers to do other investigations and take other calls. Our CSOs also do traffic control. So if a major incident occurs, if there's a major injury traffic collision, our CSOs are the ones that can go and help conduct traffic control. Our CSOs also transport property and evidence for our property room and for our sworn staff. They help maintain the vehicle's fleet. So that could take up a large amount of their time per day, depending on what's going on. For example, they might have to move a vehicle to our emergency vehicle vendor for maintenance, or moving vehicles to a dealer for maintenance. Special details can take up a large amount of our CSO's time. For example, if something significant happens, we may have to task them for that day immediately to assist with that major incident. So these are all things that limit their staff hours and makes it difficult to conduct proactive parking enforcement. Additionally, we're currently unable to use traditional tire chalking, time parking enforcement. So time parking in the city is for the entire length of El Camino Real, also the downtown area and city lots. So traditionally, time park enforcement is done by a park enforcement officer putting a chalk mark on a vehicle's tires. The CSO will go back after time limit to look for vehicles with chalk marks and process and cite them. So some recent events have presented possible liability if we're to continue chalking tires. So basically in 2019, the Sixth Circuit Court in the Michigan area had a court case where someone was issued a parking citation based on tire chalk. That person sued the city. And the Sixth Circuit Court's decision was that a parking enforcement officer chalking a vehicle's tires is an illegal search and a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So just a little explanation of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. That's the Fourth Amendment is a section in the Constitution regarding search and seizure. Right? Basically, everyone has a right to be secure and their property secured against unreasonable searches and seizures. And what that Sixth Circuit Court decision said was that a parking enforcement officer putting chalk marks on someone's tires was a violation of the Fourth Amendment. In order to properly do it, we would have to go in front of a court and ask the judge for a search warrant to put a chalk mark on a tire. So obviously that's not possible logistically. Also locally, in 2021, a class action lawsuit was filed against San Francisco for $50 million. And that same day, by the same attorney against the city of San Leandro for $5 million for those cities issuing parking citations based on tire chalking. So based on these events, the police department has had the CSO stop chalking tires to mitigate potential liability to the city. So the police department staff, we looked into the possibility of combining outsourcing parking enforcement services to private vendor using license plate reader technology, along with establishing meter parking in the downtown area as an option for mitigating these challenges, and also fulfilling some of the downtown parking studies recommendations. So outsourcing parking enforcement, it has been done with a good success in many cities, including locally by the city of San Mateo. So in 2019, San Mateo began outsourcing citywide parking enforcement to a private parking services company. They currently use a company named Lab Parking to provide those services. PD staff reached out to San Mateo Police Department staff about their experience with Lab Parking, and they said they're very satisfied with the services provided with Lab Parking and with outsourcing their parking enforcement efforts. So the Lab Parking, it's a national parking company with offices across the U.S. They typically handle things like parking garages or special events. Lab Parking has contracts with many other cities, including the city of West Hollywood, the city of Palo Alto, and San Mateo. We reached out to Last Parking because they have local contracts, they are able to provide temporary staff at an hourly rate for special events, such as saturation enforcement efforts, or say if we had a big parade, or other special event which we needed significant additional staffing. Last Parking is a member of the National Cooperative Purchasing Alliance, so their purchasing is subject to government rates. So again, police department staff and Last Parking collaboratively we created a proposed plan, which we believe will fulfill the city's parking enforcement needs and management needs, and meet many of the recommendations of the final downtown parking plan. So part of this proposal that was collaboratively created would be for Last Parking to provide 4 full-time parking enforcement officers. There would be 3 to 4 staff members on duty each day from Monday through Saturdays. Their work hours would be staggered to ensure that there's a parking enforcement officer or 2 available in the late evening hours for enforcement in the downtown area. Last Parking would also provide 2 part-time staff members to work on the first and third Mondays and Tuesdays of each month to supplement street sweeping enforcement. So again, street sweeping enforcement starts very early, about 6 in the morning. So this will allow staff to be here early in the morning for street sweeping on those days and still have staff members to work the late evening hours. As part of the proposal, Last Parking would provide a project manager and regional manager to manage the contractor services. Last Parking would also provide their own parking enforcement offices. They would lease an office somewhere within the city to give their staff location, to have briefings, use a computer, take breaks, and have parking for their vehicles. This way there wouldn't be any conflict or affecting city staff. As part of the proposal, Last Parking would provide 4 parking enforcement vehicles. Typically, the company uses vehicles like a Toyota Prius. The vehicles would be marked as Last Parking enforcement vehicles equipped with amber strobe lights, license plate readers, and a GPS system. So this would be a cost savings, right? As Last Parking is responsible for providing their own vehicles, the maintenance and insurance on the vehicles. Having the license plate reader system would help mitigate that Sixth Circuit Court decision. The license plate reader system allows for the digital chalking of vehicles for time park enforcement via photos and GPS location. So just a little quick background on that. Basically, the operator would drive the vehicle along the street. The license plate reader would capture photos of vehicles continuously along with their GPS location. On a next pass by a LPR-equipped vehicle, if the system detects that it believes the vehicle was parked there earlier, in excess of the time limits, it would flash an alert to the operator. The operator will stop the vehicle at that time and take a look and investigate the before and after pictures and make a determination if that vehicle was still there beyond the time limits. Take enforcement action at that time. Again, this is touchless. It does it with photos and GPS. It doesn't require any actual physical shocking. Again, it would help mitigate that Sixth Circuit Court decision of traditional tire shocking. So the next part of the proposal would be to establish meter parking downtown. So on November 23rd of 2021, police department staff facilitated town metered parking merchants focus group meeting. All the merchants in the area were invited to this meeting for feedback. There was overwhelming support to establish meter parking in the downtown area. The group also gave some valuable feedback and suggestions if meter parking were to be implemented. Many of their suggestions were consistent with the recommendations from the parking study itself. So the plan to establish meter parking would basically be to convert existing downtown time parking to meter parking instead. Last Parking would assist in establishing the meter parking in the downtown area, streets, and the 8 city lots. So there are many companies that provide parking meter solutions. Last parking in the proposal selected McKay Meters. McKay Meters is a large company out of Canada, so they have a current project to replace more than 18,000 parking meters in San Francisco. Last parking advised that San Bruno would receive discounted pricing because McKay Meters is already working nearby on the San Francisco project. So the proposal estimates that 31 single-space meters and 79 dual-space or dual-headed meters are needed to service the 189 street parking spaces in the downtown area. 17 pay stations would be needed to service the 8 city lots in the downtown area. So these parking meters and pay stations, they're solar powered. They use a wireless data connection, so there's no wiring required. These meters and pay stations support coin, credit card, and pay by app. The parking meters for street parking are pay by space. So just like most other cities, you pay at the meter for the space that it's next to. So the pay stations themselves for the 8 city lots support different modes. There's a pay and display, pay by space, or pay by plate. So the pay by plate is where customers go to the machine, pay. They would have to go back to the vehicle and put the receipt on the dashboard. This is inefficient for enforcement. It requires manual enforcement, where park enforcement has to actually walk each lot and look at each car for the dashboard and confirm the receipt is current. There's a pay by space mode. This is where all the parking spaces have to be individually labeled or numbered. So all these labels or numbers would have to be maintained. So this will add to the project cost and add to the ongoing maintenance costs as those labels have to be kept legible. So staff will recommend pay by plate mode. This is where the customer would go to the machine, pay for the parking, and then input their license plate number. And that would indicate that their vehicle was paid for parking. And this system integrates well into park enforcement with the vehicle license plate reader systems. It makes it very efficient. So as part of this proposal, shoppers and visitors, which are what are called the short-term parkers, again, they would pay, enter the license plate number, and they would be subject to the designated time limit of the lot, whichever that may be. The long-term parkers could be accommodated by a permit system, again, using their license plate as the permit number. This would be where business owners or employees could park in a designated lot up to a designated limit, whether it be 10 hours, all day long, whatever future study determines. And this could also facilitate a plan for residents to park in the city lots overnight after the end of normal meter hours. So this is a way to increase parking for residents overnight. So again, with this plan and proposal, it would fall in line with the recommendations of the 2019 downtown parking study to facilitate longer-term parking for businesses and employees and overnight parking in the city lots for residents. A solution to manage the parking permits would be needed. There's a company called Turbo Data Systems. This company provides Ticket Pro electronic parking citation devices. These are the electronic citation writers, as well as parking citation processing services. So the police department already uses Turbo Data Systems for these purposes. Last parking, as indicated, they would also use this company for their ticket writers for their staff. So Turbo Data also has a parking permit program available. It's a cloud-based system that allows residents to get on the system and business owners and apply for and purchase parking permits. Some of the use cases could be parking in city lots by business owners and employees, or overnight parking in the city lots by residents. This cloud-based parking permit program system could also be used to administer permits for the city's residential parking permit program. So again, the system would allow applicants to register for an account online. They would upload the required documentation, which can then be verified by city staff or Turbo Data staff. So just a little, example of that would be a business owner can maybe upload their city business license to show that this is a business that they're a part of, that they're applying for parking for. City resident could upload documents such as a water bill, etc., to show they're a resident. So the permit management system is scalable. It's designed to handle multiple permit types. So it can allow for hang tags, which are the tags that go on your mirror, or a sticker, which goes on your bumper. Again, the staff will recommend virtual permits or using a vehicle's license plate number itself as the permit. Hang tags and stickers, again, require manual enforcement. A person or staff member would actually have to go and verify, take a look, and confirm that's a legitimate and valid sticker or hang tag. With the license plate reader system, it allows much more efficient enforcement of these permits. Again, both Turbo Data staff and city staff can issue and administer these permits as needed. So the research that the police department staff did into this project came up with some estimated known costs for outsourcing parking enforcement services, establishing parking meter in downtown area and city lots, and utilizing the Turbo Data parking permit program. So what we're going to present, the capital expenditure for the parking meters and pay stations and vehicle license plate readers are built into the last parking quote to provide parking services. And so the equipment itself is financed at 7% for a 36-month term agreement. So in the proposal, last parking would provide parking enforcement services and staff, provide their own office space and vehicles equipped with LPRs. They would have the parking meters and pay station installed on pre-installed poles and pads in the downtown area and city lots through McCain meters. So with a 36-month term, the cost would be approximately $45,000 monthly. The cost for last parking to service and collect revenue from the meters and pay stations would be $3,500 monthly. This is for staff members to go around and change out the receipt rolls to collect the revenue, replace change as needed at these meters and pay stations. And then for Turbo Data Systems, for their cloud-based permit program, to manage the city's residential and business parking permit program and to issue permits, the cost would be $1,000 monthly. So just again, overall, the total estimated cost with the 3-year contract would be about $49,500 monthly, with an estimated annual cost of $594,000 annually. So at the end of this 3-year contract, the city would still retain ownership of the parking meters themselves and the pay stations and the vehicle license plate reader systems. At that point, after 3 years, the monthly costs would drastically reduce, as the only cost would be for services and fees. Staff also came up with total estimated costs with immediate purchase of equipment. So if there was an initial immediate purchase of the parking meters, the pay stations, and the vehicle license plate readers, the cost for the equipment would be $411,000. With that, the services from LAS and Turbo Data would be estimated at $30,000 monthly, with an estimated annual cost of $360,000. There's some expenses associated with this project are still to be determined. Some of the costs that would still have to be determined included installing the 110 poles for the meters and the 17 concrete pads for the pay stations. The K meters, they typically come in and install their meters and pay stations on pre-installed poles and pads. So we're working with Public Works to obtain a quote or provide an estimate for this portion of the project. Another still to be determined cost is the study's recommendation to install improved signage. So we'd have to look into installing improved signage to help drivers locate available parking and wayfinding to direct them to the city lots. Again, another still to be determined cost would be to create and adopt a new San Bruno Municipal Code chapter authorizing metered parking and metered parking violations. So again, that's another still to be determined cost. I want to talk about our current parking citation revenue. So over the past 5 years, the city has had parking citation revenue of approximately $54,995 a month. The amount alone from that historical revenue would be enough to cover the estimated cost of this program at $49,500 a month at the fixed 36-month term, or the $30,000 a month if the equipment were purchased outright. There's also a new revenue source with this program. The program should generate substantial revenues through the paid parking meters and paid city parking lots, as well as the potential sale of the various parking permits. Obviously, a further fiscal analysis would have to be done to better estimate these revenues after staff has received direction as to the parking and permitting fee amounts. But overall, the deployment of this program should generate a net fiscal gain for the city. Also, for the capital improvement program budget, City Council has previously already allocated $225,000 for installing parking meters downtown in the current CIP budget. Staff's recommendation is that City Council receive this report on downtown parking meters and enhanced parking enforcement, and provide appropriate direction on the next steps of staff. Again, some of the next steps would probably to look at what the parking rate should be, what the parking time limit should be, and what the signage should look like. There's no specific action request at this time, so there's no alternatives noted. I want to thank you guys all for your time, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Lieutenant, for your presentation and report. And I'd like to turn to my colleagues and see if there are questions on the presentation. Councilman Hamilton.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Lieutenant, for the presentation. Appreciate it, and appreciated the very detailed staff report that we were able to go over beforehand. I have a few questions. Some of them were answered. They were submitted by email by another council member, so I'll try to skip those. So these the parking enforcement folks, the contractors, I assume that they can only enforce meters. So what happens if they're cruising down the street during their job and they encounter a double parked car? What would they do in that scenario?
So last parking, they were able to do all citywide parking enforcement. It depends what directions the council would like the police department to go. Our thoughts were that 72-hour parking enforcement would be retained by our community service officers, so we can keep that community-oriented approach for 72-hour parking enforcement. But they can do all parking enforcement. So if they were to see a car double park, they can issue it a parking citation. Basically, anything our community service officers can do, we can empower them to do also, parking enforcement. The only thing, my understanding, is because they're private staff, they don't have access to DMV's computer system. So, say, example, they wouldn't be able to issue a expired registration parking citation, but they could issue it for the expired parking tab because that's visible, as we're looking at the vehicle.
Okay, great, thank you. And then this leads to the second question. I would also think, and I would imagine maybe this is just the same as would be with the CSO, but since these folks would be on the ground, they could potentially witness non-parking related crimes. Would they have any more expedited means of reporting these than a regular citizen would?
Yes, we can definitely set that up. So they have access to a internal phone line at the police department. So they can be our eyes and ears also out in the field, and they can rapidly call us for something that is beyond the scope of what they can handle.
Sure.
But they can handle many of the things that our community service officers do, which is offer, motorist assist or some traffic control for disabled motorists, things of that sort.
That's great. Thank you. Okay. So this has to do with the installation. So I'm assuming that since the meters are solar, that it's not going to be cost prohibitive to remove them and then later replace them when we do the streetscape. In other words, at some point in the future, hopefully not the too far future, but it's going to be in the future, we will be replacing the sidewalks in the street and all of that on some sort of staggered basis. So obviously the meters would need to be temporarily removed from that. But because it's all solar, I imagine that it's not going to be too cost prohibitive to do that.
I think that question will probably have to be directed towards Public Works. Again, the installation of the poles and the pads would have to be done either by Public Works staff or a third-party contractor. So I don't know what those costs would be.
Okay. So
the city manager might be able to add on to that if that's okay, Lieutenant.
Yeah. Councilmember Hamilton, we'll confirm, but it's my understanding that neither the individual poles or the pay stations require wires run underground. So you're correct. If we are redoing the sidewalk, it shouldn't be a major impediment, and they may not even have to be removed, right? You may be able to pour new sidewalk around the existing pad for the kiosk or the individual meters, but we will look into that and confirm.
Wonderful, thank you. Regarding the online parking permit program, TDS system, do we know if that system allows for guest permits? That was one, when we did the parking permit program, that was one of the sticking points for folks, for like if they're having a party or whatever, and they're going to have guests, having some kind of easy means for folks to be able to come and visit someone's home without living there. Do we know if guest permits are part of that system? And if not, is that something we can look into?
We can definitely look into and confirm, but I'm pretty sure that the program itself is scalable. Again, it can accept many different permit types. It's just what do we want to provide to Turbo Data to allow in their system.
Okay.
Yeah,
and then my last, I'm sorry.
I was just going to add in, talking to Turbo Data before, Councilmember, that is something that they're capable of doing, especially if you choose the by plate option that Lieutenant Wong talked about, because they simply would specify the time frame that plate was good in the system for the license plate readers. Gene, would you mind stopping your screen share while we're moving through?
I'm trying. I can't find it on.
So while that's happening, my last question actually was already answered by in advance, but I just want to throw it out there anyway, just for my colleagues, and that has to do with what to do with anticipated excess revenue once everything's paid for and all that. I would be very interested in having excess revenue from the program stay downtown, go into a fund for a parking garage, those the power washing, whatever it is, if it benefits downtown. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there for my colleagues to think about for the future. But as we learned over email, that's something that we would direct during the budgeting process. So that wasn't an actual question. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Councilmember Medina.
Just wanted to find the mute button. Seems kind of difficult tonight. So thank you very much. Clearly, this is a lot of effort, and it's something that is desperately needed to get the flow of traffic or parking and to assist the merchants, and especially with this latest court decision, where we need to pivot. We need to do something different, and the license plate readers seemed to be the appropriate answer. I did submit a number of questions. I won't go through all of them. I am interested in paying or going back to council and asking for the full amount instead of financing it. That is a reasonable reduction in cost by doing so. I am a little concerned about the location of the parking meters on Mastic. It's along a residential side. I didn't recall that part being added, but if it was in the parking study, the council didn't take a deep dive into that parking study. It was more of a receiving that report because we didn't have any money to do pretty much anything in that report. But I do appreciate where we're at now. A couple other questions. Other cities have these pay stations that are like on the block instead of having so many poles. The way they're set up, it seems like there's one pole for two locations, and then there'll be one pole for one location when there was an odd number on the street. So I wanted to ask if further investigation or reason why we wouldn't go to a more of a pay station on a block of the various blocks that we have. And one last thing I think would be in my question of establishing that more of an enterprise fund, that the excess revenues, which there will be, that those revenues enter some type of enterprise fund, and if the council needs to provide that clear direction, then I'm looking forward to being able to do that. Thank you very much for this. I know this is a huge amount of work. Lastly, this would be probably for the city attorney on how we would put this project out to bid. It seems like we're leaning towards just one single contractor and the appropriateness for the size of this project. I would like to get some guidance on that. So please, thank you.
City Attorney, did you wish to respond on that last point? And then we can see if Lieutenant or staff wish to answer any of the other thoughts or comments by the council member.
Sure. Just generally, Councilmember Medina will definitely work with staff to make sure that the proper process is used. Just in general, the sole source and bidding is required for projects that involve public works and construction, and this is actually a bit of a hybrid. It sort of depends on what aspect of the project you're talking about. So it might be appropriate to use an RFP process. However, as you probably know, that process is not required either under state law or under our purchasing policies. It is listed as a best practice, but there are many reasons why sometimes that practice is not used, many valid reasons. And so we'll definitely explore that with staff and make sure that they've complied with all the appropriate rules and regulations about that.
Thank you, City Attorney.
You bet.
And Councilmember Medina, I believe I can answer a question about going with meters rather than pay stations on San Mateo Avenue itself. That's a great question. So I think it comes down to cost. We definitely could do pay stations. I think the cost will just increase significantly. I think in the staff report, there were proposed parking meter and pay station locations. So just as an example, I will talk about the south end of San Mateo Avenue on the west side of the street. So if you look at the staff report, that calls for, there's 13 parking spaces. The meters themselves are about $625 for the single head, about $800 for the dual head. So if we're looking at $800, about 13 of them for that block itself would be about $10,400. The pay stations themselves are about $7,000 a single pay station won't be enough to service that entire block. It would be difficult to expect someone to walk that far to get to a pay station. So for that one small block, you would probably require 2 pay stations. So 2 pay stations would be $14,000 versus about $10,000 to service it with meters instead. So we definitely can look at that. I think the cost would just go up significantly.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
Just through the mayor, just wanted to just make sure I was following protocol here, right? So
Thank you.
That's good to know. And this will be my final question for now. I'll let my colleagues get their chance. But when you pay by phone, do you have to go to the pay station, or is that you could do it all on your phone? Is the technology there yet? I think something like that exists in South City. With the license plate, you enter your license plate, it's pretty much a zone, and you punch in, and you can pretty much park anywhere on the street. You don't need to park at any specific spot.
In our research, we actually didn't look that far. Well, my understanding is McKay meters interface with any of the pay-by-phone apps. For example, San Francisco, I believe, uses pay-by-phone. So we can select any of the pay-by-phone apps to service our meters. The next step would obviously be reach out to them and see what their abilities are.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions for now.
Hey, Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. Just want to piggyback on a couple of those questions. We'll confirm, but with the pay-by-phone apps, typically you do not need to go to a kiosk. And so I know San Francisco has a system like that. And if we're able to use those systems, you can do it totally remote. With respect to looking into an enterprise district or some way to keep the revenue in the downtown area, have received council's feedback and staff. We'll look into that. Not sure at this point that an enterprise fund is correct, but we will see if there's a mechanism to do that. In general, it will just break down into, frankly, 1 or 2 buckets. An enterprise or some district zone will allow those funds or essentially restrict those funds to only be spent in a certain area. And typically when you do an enterprise, that is set in the budget because the fund is set up that way. And in order to change that, you have to change the structure of the fund. The other way to do it is through an annual budgetary process where the council decides that there's X amount of revenue from parking meters. We're going to apply that revenue to these projects or this area. And so the ability to set up some type of zone or fund where it is set and not changed annually is, I think, where the questions have been going. And so we'll look into is that mechanism possible. I also want to point out that absolutely looking at financing versus paying for it from another source, staff will look into, and the 7% rate is the rate that was in the quote. Not to say that we can't even obtain a lower rate either through renegotiation or using a different finance mechanism if we decided to finance versus purchase outright, but obtain a lower percentage. So note that we will look into that. But I think at a higher level, when we look at the revenue versus expenditure, I just want to point out to council, I know Gene Wan did a great job presenting it, but the program is financeable or and is a net positive when you just look at the current citation revenue that the city receives and what the new cost will be, right? There's the revenue exceeds the expenditures. The revenue that is currently not programmed or forecasted is the new parking meter revenue. And so that will be done once we establish draft rates. It's also important to note, though, that if we just look at this program and the revenue versus the expenditure, that parking citation revenue is not, at this point, free revenue. It's already factored in our budget, right? And so when we bring back to you the full program, that new revenue that's not yet forecasted in order for this program to be a net neutral, we'll at least have to replace that parking citation revenue. We think it will, certainly based on the number of parking meters and the revenue that other cities obtain from parking programs. But I just wanted to note that, and I hope that that's clear, that that revenue from existing parking citations is already in our budget. And so we just can't simply use that because then we'll have a hole in our budget. So it's this new revenue that we need to project out once we have the rates and take a holistic look at the program. But the assumption is that it will be a net positive gain.
City Manager, and then we're going to go to Councilman Balzar. When we said the dollar amount that was quoted as far as citation revenue, that is not downtown. That is the entire city of San Bruno?
That is existing citation revenue, yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And City Manager, I'm glad you brought up that last point because that was really my big question is that, we're looking at sort of a wash in the cost versus our existing revenue, but that will leave a hole if we allocate it. If we take those dollars that are already programmed into the PD's operations and hand them over to an outside party, it will leave a gap. So we would have to anticipate that there'd be some additional revenue to put that back, or there would have to be staff reductions on PD side for some of those functions that were given away. It's not free money, and just from everything I've heard, I mean, parking meters are not money makers for most cities. So while I do hope that there is some net benefit that comes to this, I'd be very cautious about how those estimates are going to come out. And then, of course, there's going to be ongoing costs because, it's not just one-time equipment. You're talking about electronics, and they do have a limited life cycle, and they will have to be replaced eventually. So it's an ongoing program that has to be maintained over time. So, I know that all those things will come out in further analysis, but I do appreciate the report. It was a very good, very detailed report. It covered a lot of different aspects that we've considered along the way, so definitely appreciate all the work that went into that. Oh, and finally, the other thing was the capital expenditures. In the past, we had talked about using some dollars that were allocated as part of an agreement with a facility that was set up on the north end of town to offset the impact of trucks rolling into that neighborhood. And I think I've expressed this to the city manager before, but I don't feel it's appropriate to take those dollars away from what they were intended to do until we actually address the issues in that neighborhood. And I know that we do need startup capital for this program, but I don't think that those dollars should be programmed for this purpose.
Chief Johansson, you have your hand up.
Just briefly, Mr. Mayor, thank you. I just wanted to add, we're having this conversation about the fiscal impact here, that obviously we've identified there's a lot of additional analysis needed to really give a full picture to council. But we haven't mentioned that in all of the cities that have implemented similar solutions, the other revenue we can expect is that site revenue should increase significantly, at least in the short term. As we get greater compliance with greater citing, then those numbers will tend to level out. But the significant increased capability to, or the efficiencies in enforcement with using ALPR and the return of revenues from time parking enforcement that has been missing for more than a year now with COVID and with the chalking restrictions, I think will also provide some additional revenue to help offset these expenses.
Thank you. And before we go to the Vice Mayor, the City Manager had his hand up.
Yeah, the Chief said almost everything I was going to say, but I just wanted to clarify that, yeah, we do expect this to be a net positive revenue program once all of the revenues are factored in. We just didn't provide that at this juncture because we didn't want to have a revenue portrait that assumed parking rates without having more community engagement and discussion about what those rates will be. So we will certainly bring that back to council next time.
Vice Mayor Mason.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure when we talk about ALPR, is that the same ALPR that we've heard about that are the cameras that have been put up throughout the city?
So it's a different system. The last parking provided quotes from two different companies. One was Exigent, and one was Genentech. So both companies provide license plate readers. These are going to be vehicle-based. It's predominantly, it's going to operate inside its own closed system for parking enforcement purposes. So it's not the same company as the license plate readers we have currently in the city.
Okay, thank you for that. So how is the procurement going to be different for the two companies? The way that ALPR, I guess ALPR cameras were procured for the company that we have now versus the one that we're looking at?
I can probably answer that, Mr. Mayor. So there really are two completely different systems. The flock system are stationary automated license plate readers designated specifically to collect data and compile that data over 30-day periods of time for the purpose of investigative leads. These license plate readers are mobile, mounted on vehicles, and used, as Lieutenant Wong said, within a closed system for the specific purpose of cross-referencing against a database of plates that are entered into the system as having paid to park, to give the enforcement officers the knowledge they need to know what vehicles need to receive tickets. It doesn't run the plates through the stolen vehicle system or through a hot plate system or through the state systems that the flock system does. So it's really two very different purposes. And so the procurement is also very different. In this case, they'll handle the installation on their vehicles, but we will own the equipment when the lease is over.
Okay, so then what would be what was the process for the other ones, and what's the process for this one? Because I think they both probably surpass the threshold requiring a bid, but that's an assumption I'm making. So if I'm wrong, let me know. But I'm curious to know what the competitive bidding process was and is, and how they're going to be different.
And so if City Attorney, I see has come online. So for right now, we'll turn it over to the City Attorney, and if other staff members want to jump in, please feel free.
Sure. Sorry to jump in. I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So the process of purchasing equipment is not a process that requires a state-required competitive bidding process like public contracts, for example, building, a new building or doing construction activities. So those contracts are covered instead by the city's purchasing policy, which is, I mentioned briefly before, lists a request for proposals as a best practice, but is not required. So there's no state law process that is required to procure the contract for the license plate reader. It's not a public works project, and so the city can use a variety of methods to procure that contract, and we'll be looking in to make sure that it's done properly. As far as the dollar threshold, there's no dollar threshold involved in the procurement process. The dollar threshold relates only to the city manager's authority to sign contracts for a certain amount, and then which contracts of that have to go to the city council. So that's not related to the procurement, directly related to the procurement process.
Oh, and what is that threshold?
$75,000 for the city manager.
So that this would be over that based on the slides we just saw, right?
Right. So that would establish that the decision to enter into the contract goes to the city council, but it doesn't necessarily establish the type of method that is used to obtain proposals for the contract. So the dollar threshold is not necessarily related to that.
And then, Vice Mayor, I'd like to bring in the city manager to add to that if possible. Thank you.
Yep. The city attorney's last point was what I was going to say, which is the threshold of this contract will go to the city council. I do want to ask the city attorney to articulate a little bit about the National Purchasing Cooperative Alliance, and that was in Gene Wong's presentation. But I know we've had conversations with council before about using purchasing cooperatives or piggybacking off other public processes for contracting, which is totally valid and appropriate. It is an allowance to not have to do a city RFP process when you piggyback off those other processes. And so this last parking is a part of that National Cooperative Purchasing Alliance. So I'll turn it over to the city attorney to give that articulation.
Oh, sure. Yes, I know. And thanks for reminding me to say something about that. Yeah, so those, in essence, the theory behind those cooperatives is they've already done the RFP process for a variety of cities, either regionally or statewide or sometimes nationally. And as a result of that, they have, in essence, procured the best price for those services or that equipment. And so the use of those cooperatives is something that is specifically authorized by our code, by our municipal code, and is an appropriate method to obtain those contracts. The city could certainly issue its own request for proposals if it thought that the cooperative did an unsatisfactory job, or if there's some other independent reason to want to do it that independently. But generally, use of those cooperatives makes policy sense because they've already done the detailed RFP work that would save the city the time and expense to do that.
Okay, thank you. And these are all under the cooperative purchasing? Right there, will they all fall under that eventually, or once we identify and cement the companies that are going to be used? It sounds like the companies are already known based on this show we just saw.
Yeah. So I'll respond to that through the mayor. So last parking is certainly a part of the National Cooperative Purchasing Alliance. Turbo Data is a system that we use currently within the police department. And so my understanding is this will just be extending our use of a system that we currently use. And so that specific contracting process, let's call that a PDE, because I don't want to speak about detailed knowledge of that. And then if I flip to the other portion, yeah, there's Turbo Data, last parking, and last parking. Last parking for the service and collection of the revenue, essentially the maintenance of the pay stations, and then the larger amount, the $45, the $45,000 per month for the parking management services. So that's personnel and paying for the meters if we were to finance them. And so there are two components of LAS, and Turbo Data is a vendor that we already use.
So I'll probably follow up. I know I brought up a concern around purchasing. That's been kind of an ongoing one to make sure that we have a policy in place. And so it ties into every department at the agency. So I can talk more with the city manager offline. But I do just want to make sure that we're giving different companies an opportunity, especially into this area that, may be a growing area. I don't know enough about it, but I just want to ensure that we're looking at all of our options and getting the best price for the services and goods that we're getting. I also just wanted to clarify, are you also asking us to provide input on preferred hours? I think there was one of the last slides was requesting direction for parking max and cost. And I wasn't sure if you wanted a response to that, Lieutenant.
When we did our focus group meeting with the downtown merchants, one of the things that they had concerns about is what will become of the time parking lots. So currently the lots are 2 hours or 5 hours is what the limits are. Their initial concern was they want to be able to park there while they're at work, beyond those limits. But I think this parking permit program would allow them to do that. So the question is, what is the direction for the city lots themselves for time parking for the short-term parkers, which is like the customers or shoppers? Should the lots be 2-hour lots or 5-hour lots, or keep it as it is and have a mixture and have the good wayfinding signs so they can find the proper lot depending on how long they want to stay in that downtown area?
Okay. I would recommend the mixture on the San Mateo Avenue and then the lots being a little bit longer. For me, other council members may have different thoughts, but I think that would keep traffic moving on San Mateo Avenue, and then allow those who want to stay longer to get there maybe earlier or just wait and look for parking. I see that Chief Johansson and the city manager have their hands up, so I have something else, but they can speak first.
I'll let the chief go. Ryan?
I was just going to say, to answer kind of your question, Vice Mayor, about what we'll be looking for in terms of direction. Hopefully in April, we would plan to bring forth a detailed map of the area after doing more consulting with LAS. that would specify what their recommendations are for what the different rates should be in the different zones based on proximity to the busier areas. And what it won't have is your knowledge of the city and input. So what we'll be looking for in April at that point is to bring that map forward to get input from council about are they on point, or do you want us to look to move in different directions regarding what the different rates should be in the different areas and how long we should allow people to park in different areas, as well as what those permits should look like for businesses and their employees. So that is the next scheduled step in this process.
Yeah. And if I just piggyback on that, right now we have certain areas that are designated for longer term parking. Through this new program, we can actually adjust that where we don't have certain areas that are pre-designated for longer term parking, but permits that are provided for longer term parking. So for example, during the normal business day in downtown, any individual would be subject to the time parking. Let's say that's 2 hours. But in order to receive a 5 or 10 hour permit, you would have to have a permit. And so maybe we do 10-hour permits for employees and business owners downtown. But in order to get that access, you would have to pre-register through the city to open up that window for a 10-hour permit. And then in the evening, potentially some lots or all lots with different analysis, we can determine, okay, well, these lots will be available for overnight or evening and morning parking for residents, and that's a different permit that requires you cannot be in the lot before X, and you have to be out before Y.
Yeah, I would just say, based on my other worlds, there are parking permits that are sold, as you're suggesting in this case, to private businesses. In that case would be different departments. But I would just recommend that everybody be clear that those permits do not qualify within the yellow zone, within the green zone, and that whatever tickets you get, you still have to pay for if you don't follow those rules. And then the other suggestion that I actually got from a couple of business owners when I met with them recently was to consider making the parking permits part of the annual business fee, so that when they pay their annual business fee, one, they're encouraged to get it on time because they're going to need they don't want an expired parking permit, but two, it's like an extra box that would be checked off when they're paying for their annual business license. And then they also suggested maybe within that folding in, and this would be different because you'd actually be including a whole different entity, but the Chamber of Commerce membership potentially in that. I would definitely support, though, the annual business license being included with this parking permit opportunity, because they could just pay both at once and they have to have their business license, or if they think they don't have to have the business license, they're going to want their parking permit. So just a suggestion. Thank you for all the work that's been done on this. I look forward to seeing this evolve and progress into reality. Thank you.
Councilor Medina.
Yes, just wanted to follow up on the next step and making sure that we do reach out to the business owners. I believe there was one meeting, and that was during COVID. So as COVID kind of hopefully continues to ease away, that we have a community meeting, because there are so many variables here, depending on which parking lot, when it's being used, and then the whole residential portion of it. And where are the parking meters going to be on the residential areas along Mastic? Is that something that I don't recall, and perhaps the residents aren't aware of it? I think you'd be a little surprised if in front of your house that there's now a parking meter. So I think we should be cognizant of that and make sure that we do have a couple meetings to make sure that our residents and our business owners are really aware of what's going on here. Thank you.
Is there anything else from colleagues on this topic? Okay. Very quick, I was in the city yesterday at an event and used their meter parking. So And obviously it's a coin, the credit card, very simplistic, no paper. Also speaking to the city manager of South San Francisco at the event, they do have it, so it is set up for the businesses. So again, one of the complaints I know we do get from ours businesses, I have to have, depending on where my employee or the employee part, they have to go move their car so often, and that becomes challenging. Or if they're the only one in the establishment at the time, what are we supposed to do? Close the door. The city manager of South San Francisco, had indicated that even in their parking structure, you can rent a spot, and the rate was actually very good as far as what the monthly rate would be. Thinking about what other places may charge. So I think there's a combination of things that might be able to work, but I think it was very mindful of the point about the money. It's not just sitting in a bucket in the savings account. We can just take it out, take it, withdraw, and not worry about it. It is allocated for work that is being done currently and needs to continue. So with that, I know we spent some time on this. So is there anything else, Lieutenant, Chief, or City Manager on this topic?
No, thank you, Council, for the feedback, and we will proceed and return with the City Council with the other components of the program, as well as undertake additional community and business engagement.
Thank you. Moving on to item B, waive the first reading and introduce the ordinance.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes,
I don't know if we have any public, but we don't need to look for public comment.
I have checked, but it never hurts to say it so that it's clear that it was done, so I appreciate it. If there's any, thank you. If there's any public comment on this topic A. Seeing none, I recognize the names, but I think they're within the PD. Item B, waive the first reading and introduce the ordinance chapter 2.52 regarding police department acquisition and use of military equipment, approve military equipment use policy. We're going to go over to the chief for this one, and again, this is a action item, a requirement that the state, I believe it's the state, chief will correct me. Anyway, it's a requirement that we have to do, so the chief is bringing it forward. It's something else that has been required of the cities to do, and here we are. Chief.
Sorry, just one moment. I realize I can't mute once I share my screen, so I had to go back there. Figure it out one day, I promise. Okay. Mr. Mayor, able to give me a thumbs up so you can see my screen?
You're good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council, for accommodating us in this meeting that is exclusively for police department related items. I know that your meeting schedule has been rigorous and will continue to be, but I really do appreciate you giving us some time to get these very necessary items in front of you. Unfortunately, what I'm going to report to you now or on to you now is not nearly as exciting as the idea of finally solving so many of our parking problems that have been long-standing downtown, but it is nonetheless very necessary. It's going to be somewhat dry, so I will attempt to get through it relatively quickly and get really to your questions, which is probably the most important component. But I am here to report on the military equipment use ordinance and the military equipment use policy. The objective here is to waive the first reading and introduce this ordinance, Chapter 252, regarding the police department acquisition and use of military equipment, and to approve the military equipment use policy by resolution or through this meeting. The agenda, I'll touch on the background where this is all coming from and why you're listening to me talk about it this evening, as well as talk a little bit, have some discussion about the proposed ordinance that is required by law, as well as a discussion of the proposed military equipment use policy itself that the police department has drafted. I will share with you the qualifying equipment under these laws that is possessed by the police department presently, as well as qualifying equipment that is possessed by our North County Regional SWAT team, which we do participate in as San Bruno PD, and then make a recommendation and some potential alternatives, as well as take your questions. So the background here is that California Assembly Bill 481, which I'll refer to here as AB 481, passed, which requires a governing body approval prior to taking certain actions regarding the funding, the acquisition, or the use of military equipment as defined by the code. This is to be accomplished through the adoption of a military equipment use policy by ordinance, which is why we're here to speak about the ordinance and the use policy this evening. It also requires renewal of your authorization annually which will be based upon an annual military equipment report delivered to you by the police department. On the heels of AB 481 came some government code sections designed to codify the requirements within that assembly bill. And those are the government code sections 70, 71, and 72. These codes define military equipment as well as many of the other essential terms to figuring out exactly what it is we have to do here. Also establishes the requirement for a city ordinance, establishes the requirement of a military equipment use policy and defines what that is. Also establishes the requirement that I deliver or that the police department deliver to you as the governing body an annual military equipment report that basically delineates all the uses of military equipment as defined here each year so that you can ensure compliance with the ordinance that is passed and the policy that has been in front of you. Also establishes some public outreach and transparency requirements, and all of this is supposed to be done by May 1st of 2022. This is not necessarily a real hard, fast deadline because the code says somewhat ambiguously that we have to commence this process no later than May 1st, 2022. But then it ties some other timelines to the back of it, which is why I'm trying to get to you well ahead of time here on March 1st in an effort to make sure that we comply with all the laws that are still a little bit unclear and undefined at this stage. It's important to note here that AB 481 originated based on what we in law enforcement refer to as the 1033 program. The 1033 program was essentially a means by which local law enforcement agencies could acquire surplus military equipment from the United States military. Through a grant program. So you could request military equipment that's no longer being utilized by the Marines, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force to assume into local use. And the goal there obviously was to say, look, there is all this equipment sitting there with the military that probably could be used in municipalities, and it could save you a lot of money to apply to get it for free through a grant. Obviously, this raised some red flags where people were concerned, communities concerned, politicians concerned about acquiring equipment from the military. And I certainly could understand that concern. I wanted to come right out tonight and tell you that we do not at San Bruno Police Department possess any equipment ever obtained through the 1033 program. We do not possess or use any equipment we have obtained through the military, period. Nor do we nor have we obtained any equipment that is designed for military use. That being said, the 481 and the subsequent government codes did establish a significant expansion of the definition of military equipment, and in fact listed 16 types of equipment. Again, they list it by type that they consider to be military equipment. And the San Bruno Police Department does possess 4 of these types of equipment, and that's part of what I'll be reporting to you tonight. So now a discussion of the proposed ordinance in front of you, this Chapter 2.52 of the Muni Code. These are the different sections that I'll be going over in the subsequent slides. The first being the name of the ordinance. Not probably a lot for discussion here. Staff has recommended a name that is consistent with the verbiage of AB 481 and the subsequent California government codes, just to ensure that it's very clear that this ordinance specifically pertains to AB 481 and the various government codes. The next section being definitions. The language in this section has been taken directly from California Government Code Section 7070, which provides the definitions relevant to AB 481. The key ones that I think are of note here are, again, that they do define military equipment quite clearly as falling within the 16, it's actually 15 with sort of one catch-all at the end, types of equipment that qualify, as well as defining a military equipment use policy and telling us as a law enforcement agency what it is we have to put before you in terms of that policy document. And then also establishing what exactly needs to be included in that annual military equipment report that you'll be receiving every year after approving the policy itself. The next section covers the military equipment use policy requirement. This, again, is taken directly from the government code section, this time 7071. We're trying to use the exact language in the bills and the codes to ensure that we are compliant with everything that we're required to do, both you as a governing body and us as a law enforcement agency. The key element here is that, again, it establishes that we have to provide a military equipment use policy to you, council or governing body, for approval, and it also makes it very clear what must be included in that policy. The next section is a very important one for safety in our community. This I'm calling the use and exigent circumstances section. This is very critical to both public and officer safety in our community because, quite frankly, we just operate in a world where we can't foresee all possible circumstances and needs. But I do understand that we need a system of accountability, and that's what we've attempted to codify here in this Section 252040. Used a very restrictive definition of exigent circumstances as a law enforcement agency's good faith belief that an emergency involving the danger of or imminent threat of death or serious physical injury to any person is occurring, has occurred, or is about to occur. And this section would allow us to implement the use of military equipment that is maybe not covered in the existing policy under exigent circumstances and would require us to come before you within 30 days to report on that use thoroughly. What exactly we used, how we used it, why we used it, and you would then have the ability through the annual report to opine on whether you feel that that use is appropriate and should be continued in the future or not in the form of a policy. The next section is reports on the use of military equipment, again, taken directly from Government Code, this time 7072. This is the annual report we're required to deliver to you. I think what's really important about this section is we've mirrored the language about exactly what we must report to you in this annual delivery, and it also establishes some specific public notice and transparency components that are really important to ensure a codified for the accountability piece. And finally, a simple severability clause that I think is relatively standard to previous ordinances chapters that council has taken a look at. So now moving kind of to the meat and potatoes of this thing, which is a discussion of the proposed military equipment use policy. The police department is not requesting approval to purchase or acquire any new military equipment as defined in this code. However, in accordance with the law, what we are requesting is approval to continue using equipment that we already possess and utilize, which has now been classified as military equipment under these codes. California Government Code 70, Section 7070D, like David, establishes what a military equipment use policy is. It means a publicly released written document governing the use of military equipment by a law enforcement agency or a state agency that addresses at a minimum all of the following. And the next couple slides are going to delineate for you what is supposed to be in the military equipment use policy that is before council this evening. First, it must include a description of each type of military equipment, the quantity sought, its capabilities, its expected lifespan, the product description from a manufacturer wherever possible, and of the military equipment wherever possible, my apologies. Has to include the purposes and authorized uses for which the law enforcement agency or the state agency proposes to use each type of military equipment, the fiscal impact of that equipment, including not only the initial costs, but the costs of annual maintenance on a regular basis, the legal and procedural rules that govern each authorized use, if appropriate, the training, including any that's mandated by Cal Post, that must be completed before any officer or our agent is permitted to utilize this military equipment, and also to make sure that it is ensuring the full protection of the public's welfare, safety, civil rights, and civil liberties. The mechanisms to ensure compliance with the military equipment use policy, including which independent persons or entities has oversight authority, and if applicable, what legally enforceable sanctions are put in place for violations of the policy. That would essentially be through this ordinance and the review of council, our governing body, is how we accommodate 6. And finally, 7, we have to include the procedures by which members of the public may register complaints or concerns or submit questions about the use of each specific type of military equipment, and how we'll ensure that those complaints or concerns are addressed in a timely manner. And in the policy before you, all of these items are included for each type of military equipment being put in front of council today. Finally, California Government Code Section 7071B requires that we post the proposed military equipment use policy to our public website at least 30 days prior to any public meeting considering it. This was accomplished prior to today's meeting by posting the proposed military equipment use policy to the police department's website on January 26th. So it has been up in excess of the 30 days required. This section also establishes that the City Council should only approve the military equipment use policy if it determines all of the following. 1, that the military equipment is necessary because there is no reasonable alternative that can achieve the same objective of officer safety and civilian safety. 2, that the proposed equipment use policy will safeguard the public's welfare, safety, civil rights, and civil liberties. 3, that if we're purchasing the equipment, which again we are not requesting to do in this particular case, that it is reasonably cost-effective compared to available alternatives. And 4, that prior prior military equipment use complied with the military equipment use policy that was in effect at the time. So this really applies to subsequent years where we'll be coming before you with this annual report, and part of what you should consider and whether or not to continue with the same policy or amend it or request any other revisions from staff is whether or not we have complied with your directions to that point. And that gets reported in this annual military equipment use report. Again, we have to have this at the avenues through which members of the public can register their complaints or concerns, submit questions. I put them here in this slide just so that you can see that they're also, this is in the military equipment use policy itself. But to be clear, we have provided not only an email address, a phone number, but also an ability for them to send physical mail and have their questions answered in a timely fashion. This email address forwards directly to command staff responsible for oversight of the military equipment use policies, so they will be responded to promptly. So let's talk a little bit about qualifying equipment that is possessed by your police department. Again, the government code provides a list of 16 types of equipment that qualifies as military equipment for the purposes of the law, and we possess equipment in 4 of these type groups or categories. Each of these equipment types are specifically listed in the military equipment use policy, and each entry includes all 5 information elements required by law as previously reported a couple slides ago. But I'll go through them briefly here just for sake of the conversation and so that we can potentially queue up questions from council. We do possess unmanned remotely piloted aerial vehicles. We have 3 unmanned aircraft systems or drones. These are generally used for search and rescue, suspect apprehension, crime scene documentation, tactical operations, scene security, hazard monitoring, identification and mitigation, response to emergency calls, crisis communications, and legally authorized surveillance. The reason why we possess these and request to continue using them is because there is no reasonable alternative that can achieve the same operational objectives of officer and civilian safety as the UAS drones. The next type of equipment we possess are command vehicles. We do possess 1 mobile command vehicle, as council is well aware. We've talked about it quite a bit in the past. It's a little bit interesting to me that this is included in military equipment because it specifies that it's capable of managing operations or directing resources in an emergency, that it should be reported here, which is why I'm reporting it to you. However, this is not tactical equipment in any way, shape, or form. Our vehicle is not armored or weaponized in any way. It's not used for troop transport or anything along those lines. It is simply used to facilitate more competent command, unified command during critical and planned incidents. Again, our argument for possessing this is that there is no reasonable alternative that can achieve the same objective, as was evidenced in the YouTube active shooter incident that was the impetus for the purchase of this vehicle in the first place. We do possess what are classified as specialized firearms. We possess 53 semi-automatic rifles. Now, these are standard issue duty weapons, meaning we issue 1 to every police officer just like we do the handgun that's on their belt. And as such, they are actually exempted from inclusion in the policy that I'm putting before council today. However, in the interest of full transparency and due to the fact that there may be a little bit of a lack of clarity in this law due to its newness and the fact that it hasn't been litigated at any level yet, I am including this here just so that it is fully in front of you, council. You recently authorized this purchase, so I know that you are aware of these rifles, but we do possess them and I'm reporting them here. You can read here how it's generally used, but essentially this comes directly from policy. If an officer reasonably anticipates an armed encounter, if they're faced with a situation that may require accurate and effective fire at long range, or they reasonably expect the need to meet or exceed a suspect's firepower, they can make the decision to remove the rifle from its mount and deploy it. Again, there is no reasonable alternative that can achieve the same objective of officer and civilian safety as these rifles. And finally, we possess 40mm less lethal launchers. This is also something council is probably aware of because it was approved in the previous year's budget. We possess 16 less lethal projectile launchers. These are capable of launching rubber and foam projectiles. They're generally used as an alternative to lethal force to protect life and apprehend suspects. The classic example, right, is the suspect with a knife that many times, unfortunately, may necessitate the use of lethal force, but having a 40mm gives you the opportunity to deploy something that is far less likely to have lethal consequences and can still generate essentially the same outcome. So this is a very important component in our use of force matrix and the fact that we want to make sure that when we're encountering the many complex situations we encounter in law enforcement, we have a whole litany of force options so that we don't have officers deferring to a more extreme level of force simply because the lower level options weren't available to them. The 40 millimeter less lethal could be thought of as a taser that just has a much longer range, slightly different operating mechanism of gaining compliance, but allows us to deal with a high level of resistance from a much farther distance, and that is an alternative or a objective that cannot be achieved through some other alternative that we are presently aware of. And finally, talking briefly about qualified equipment possessed by NCR SWAT. So it's somewhat important to understand that what Council is actually approving is the authorized use of military equipment within your jurisdiction, within the city. That means that it doesn't matter if it's the San Bruno Police Department using military equipment or some other law enforcement entity. They need to act in accordance with the policy that you approve of. And I think that this is important because we know from many incidents here in San Bruno that mutual aid is fast arriving and very much something we rely on with a department that's staffed the way we are and the types of problems that we encounter. Classic examples obviously are the Glenview pipeline explosion, the YouTube active shooter incident, the Tamfran active shooter incident. We have a lot of outside agencies coming in to help us. And the fact is that it would be almost impossible for me to put before you a list of all the equipment possessed by all of the entities that might respond to an incident here in San Bruno, because we're in the middle of urban sprawl, where, for example, at the YouTube active shooter incident, the FBI was on scene in a matter of minutes going from San Francisco. And so it's virtually impossible to report all the things that could ever potentially be used here. But NCR SWAT, I felt, was something important to report to you and to be fully forthcoming about because we participate in the North County Regional SWAT team. And this is the entity we are most likely to rely on in those incidents all the time. So there might be other variables, but NCR SWAT is going to be here for those types of incidents. Again, they're generally only deployed in extreme circumstances such as active shooter, hostage situations, the execution of high-risk search and arrest warrants, but they are here and we participate in the team. And so in the use policy you have before you, I've included the equipment that they possess and use. It's important to note that that equipment is not purchased by us, it's not owned by us, it's not maintained by us. And so we only have a certain amount of control over kind of what gets done with it in the long haul, but we do have some control over how it gets utilized here, and that's why it's been included in the policy. So the following is a list of the types of qualifying equipment possessed by NCR SWAT, which are not also possessed by San Bruno PD, meaning that you've already seen it on the other end of this use policy through the equipment we possess. I'm not going to go into as much detail on these types in this presentation as I did with the San Bruno equipment, but it is all there, the same exact 5 points of data on every piece of equipment in military equipment use policy for your review. The SWAT team does possess unmanned, remotely piloted, powered aerial and ground vehicles, so they have robots and drones. They possess mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles or armored vehicles, MRAPs, personnel carriers. They possess high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, commonly referred to as Humvees or 2.5-ton trucks, that have breaching or entry apparatus attached. So these are the large vehicles that have the ability to pull down security doors, or create, high-level challenging breaches when normal methodologies of getting in will not work. They also possess command and control vehicles similar to our mobile command vehicle. They do possess a command vehicle that is armored as well. They possess and use battering rams, slugs, and breaching apparatuses that are explosive in nature. They possess specialized firearms and ammunition less than 50 caliber. This is essentially their rifles that they possess that are very similar to ours. They possess and use flashbang grenades and explosive breaching tools, tear gas, and pepper balls. They do possess an LRAD, which is a long-range acoustic device. Essentially puts out acoustic vibrations that are designed to make people uncomfortable to the point where they will stop their resistance. They also use the 40 millimeter projectile launchers, but I listed it here as well because they do also possess beanbags, which the police department doesn't really use much anymore. And some specialty impact ammunition weapons. Happy, of course, in the questions section, by the way, to provide further elaboration in these areas, but in the interest of time, I'm trying to get through the equipment that's not mine in a relatively fast fashion. So the recommendation, staff recommends that City Council waive the first reading and introduce the Ordinance Chapter 252 regarding the Police Department acquisition and use of military equipment in accordance with state law. This is just simply about compliance. And then the piece that is also about compliance, but certainly merits probably more conversation here, is approve the military equipment use policy by motion. As an alternative, you could certainly request additional information before introducing the ordinance and or adopting the policy. I would simply ask, of course, to be sensitive to the timelines that I laid out earlier in the presentation. So that does conclude my presentation on the military equipment use policy and ordinance. And of course, I am happy to field any questions.
Thank you very much, Chief. I have a quick question on staff's time with the attorney, yourself, and others in your department. About how long did this new law take to get all this done and presented to us?
It would be difficult for me to answer, but it has been a lot of time invested. Most of it invested by me personally. This is something I took on with Al Chiefs as they were looking for some leadership to kind of get behind this and figure out what we needed to do. And so I've been very involved with this for the last several months. And much of the rest of the state is taking direction from what we've put together to help put our own ordinances together.
Thank you. Questions from colleagues on the presentation? Let's see if there's, we're going to go to the Vice Mayor in a second. We'll also, if there's anybody there from the public, if you could please raise your hand. After the Vice Mayor, we're going to go see if there's any public input or comments. Vice Mayor.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, where on the website is it? Because I'm just looking for it, and I'm not sure I'm seeing it. So I may just be missing it.
Chief?
Give me a second to try to find, because it moved around a bit with the new website. But it should be in the same location as press releases. It's a label for a document there.
Okay. You're searching, or we're looking. Let's see if there's any members of the public that wish to speak. Seeing none, we'll bring it back to council. City Manager.
Yeah, I was just going to help out the police chief because I was able to find it. So I'll share screen. So it's under police policies, and so when you go to the city's main homepage, you navigate to, so it just comes up again, departments, police policies. So it's actually just one click away, and it's right there under police policies with the draft policy here.
So, in what I do know about this this rule, the intent was to make sure that we're being transparent with the community around what's the police department and the city's engaging in. And so what I would say is that I'm kind of uncomfortable with the fact that this is a special meeting and it's being held as a special meeting at 6:30 on a Tuesday night. And I don't actually think it's that easy to find because you actually have to know what you're looking for on the website to get there. There's no notice on the front page that there's a 30-day comment period at all. I don't know what the social media, I know the police department has actually been doing a great job on social media, and I commend those who are behind that. I don't remember seeing that there's an announcement for a 30-day notice, and if I missed it, let me know. But I would support this if the next iteration is an action item as opposed to a consent, where there's a presentation provided for the public and an opportunity for public comment. But otherwise, I don't think it's that transparent at this time. That's in where the search that you have to make for this 30-day comment period.
Council Member Hamilton.
So, more of a curiosity. You alluded to this, Chief, when you talked about the command vehicles being on the list, which was odd. Having drones on the list also seems odd to me because, I mean, I have to ask the obvious question. Obviously, drones aren't armed, correct?
That's correct. I think that military drones can be armed, but our drones are most certainly not armed.
Yeah, so it just seems odd. I understand the intent of the law and support that intent. It just seems like there was a lot of strange additions in that list. Through your work through there, do you have any idea why those things were added to that list? Again, curiosity.
Certainly anecdotally, I can say that, again, this started with a focus on the 1033 program. That's where the legislative conversations began. And then the reality is that notice, the requirement to report what was in your 1033 program came out 2 years ago. And the reality is almost no police departments, certainly in the Bay Area, are requiring equipment from the military through 1033. So there was nothing reported. And I think that may shine a little bit more of a light as like, okay, well, if you're not reporting anything, then we're going to expand the list of equipment we want you to report on just to really make sure that we're getting the information that we wanted to get out.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
Seeing no other hands, Vice Mayor?
And I would just add to that, to Councilmember Hamilton, that there are concerns around drones and privacy rights as well, and that's probably one of the reasons it's also included in there.
Seeing no other hands, this is a request for an action item. If there is, the first item would be to waive the first reading. Mr. Salazar.
Through the chair, I'll make the motion to waive that first reading.
Second.
Salazar Medina, motion seconded. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Hamilton?
Aye.
Councilmember Medina?
Aye.
Councilmember Salazar?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Mason?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear whether we're going to be allowing this to come back on action versus consent.
This is just to waive the reading.
This is just to waive the reading. It's not introducing the ordinance.
Oh, to not have to read it out loud. Okay. Yes, aye.
Mayor Medina?
Aye. Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Now the next item would be the introducing the ordinance, making a motion to approve the military use policy. However, let's go to the Vice Mayor's question, if we could quickly.
Oh, so if you're coming back to me,
Yes,
when this comes back, to ensure that it's on action and allow for discussion and public comment on this particular item, not on consent.
I'm just waiting for the stuff. City Manager.
So noted. If that is the direction of council, we will certainly agendize it at a regular meeting for action and have a similar presentation as the one you received here tonight.
City Attorney?
Right. Yes, if I may, sorry to interrupt, just so we're clear. So assuming that there is a motion to introduce the ordinance tonight, then the ordinance would be introduced. And then at the next regular meeting, it would be scheduled for adoption. And adoption is normally scheduled for the consent calendar, but I'm understanding that there's a desire to have that adoption be on the conduct of business and to have a public presentation. Is that correct? Okay,
Yeah, that's what the Vice Mayor is asking, but the City Manager, has rightfully so, said, obviously we need to have a concurrence or a majority.
Understood.
Thank you both. Councilmember Hamilton.
So I would concur. I mean, obviously I don't want to have to make us go through the whole presentation again, but I do think that it's important considering that there's no public present. And might also suggest that if there hasn't been social media outreach pointing people to that page where the policy is written, that we do that, and I'd be happy to amplify that through my own channels, and as I'm sure my colleagues would as well, in advance of that meeting. I think that would just be good practice considering what the purpose of this whole procedure is in terms of being transparent.
Councilmember Medina.
I concur. I'm fine with it moving forward this way, and we're having a lot of meetings, and I think people are kind of overloaded with attending our meetings. We don't get many people attending in Zoom, and maybe when we return back into person, maybe we'll get more. Who knows? Thank you.
The City Manager.
Sure. We will utilize social media channels to announce the draft military use policy. I'll just want to let council know that I think we'll likely have to do something more extended, just because a military use policy in your typical very short social media post may give the implication that we're buying or have or acquiring new typical military equipment. And so this presentation provided a lot of context around what we're doing and why it's required. And social media doesn't always afford that ability. And so I think we'll work with the police department and our communications folks here to figure out an appropriate way to get the message out. But it may not just be a quick post.
Thank you for that clarity and very valid point. Okay, if we are ready to continue, then this is, we would need a motion to introduce the ordinance, which would be approving the military equipment use policy. Oh, I'm sorry, City Attorney. First introduce the ordinance.
Yes, that's right. So okay. Separate action.
Yes.
One to introduce and then a separate action by motion. Yep.
So first is the introduction of the, introduce the ordinance. Is there any action from council?
Through the mayor?
Please.
I'll make a motion to introduce the ordinance, Chapter 2.52, regarding police department acquisition and use of military equipment.
Thank you.
Second.
Motion and second, Hamilton Medina. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Hamilton?
Aye.
Councilmember Medina?
Aye.
Councilmember Salazar?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Mason?
Aye.
Mayor Medina?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Now, third action item is the motion and a second to approve the military equipment use policy. Please. Council? I'll go ahead and make the motion to approve the military equipment use policy. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Medina. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Hamilton?
Aye.
Councilmember Medina?
Aye.
Councilmember Salazar?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Mason?
Abstain.
Mayor Medina?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, motion carries 4-1. Thank you again, Chief. And with that, City Attorney, I think that meets the needs there. Okay, let's move on.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Medina.
It'd be 401, right?
Correct.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for
Just
that.
want to make sure.
Correction. 401. Thank you. One abstention. We're going to move it on to item D. We obviously are coming to 7 o'clock, but let's continue on. This one is item C, receive report on reducing the impact of drugs on families, pilot program. Chief Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a moment to get my screen shared again here, please. And are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much, sir. Once again, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. Again, my name is Ryan Johansson, the Chief of Police, and this presentation is on reducing the impact of drugs on families, what I'm calling the Rid of Pilot Program. The objective here is to provide council with a report on Rid of Pilot Program to let you know where it came from and where we're going with it and what we're trying to accomplish. In terms of an agenda, I'll give a brief background as to where this came from, the impetus to create this program, cover the key components of the pilot program, give you a timeline on what we were hoping to meet in rolling it out, and talk a little bit about a San Bruno Community Foundation grant award, and then, of course, take your questions. So background here is that we have an epidemic level drug problem, and it's hitting right here at home. In fact, in 2021, there were more deaths in San Francisco from drug overdose than there were for COVID-19. It's estimated that 10.1 million people per year misuse opioids alone. More than 70,000 people a year die of drug overdose. In recent years, more than 70% of those have been specifically from opioids. And it's right here in San Bruno. Over the past 2 years, we've seized enough fentanyl to kill the entire population of San Bruno 3 times. We've administered hundreds of emergency naloxone doses, and we are encountering fentanyl and other opioids on a daily basis at the police department. It's also important to bear in mind that this is not in lieu of the other drugs we've been dealing with for a very long time. We're also seeing a huge surge in methamphetamine use. Some of the challenges here are that this new drug landscape is emergent, it's new, and it's poorly understood. Opioids don't look, smell, or act like any other drugs that most of us are used to seeing in the past. It's far more dangerous than anything we've ever dealt with. There are multiple methods of use that most people are not familiar with when it comes to opiates and opioids. The signs of use are not as initially obvious as with other drugs that we've seen in the past. And there's this anxiety-relieving component that makes it very attractive, especially to our youth, as well as makes it very addictive. Also, in terms of the background, I think that the elimination of the Deter program has left a huge void in our community. Deter was an early research-based drug education on things like the appearance of drugs, how drugs are used, the effects of drugs, the dangers of drugs, the symptoms of use, aimed at educating kids as to what to really expect out of the rumor mill world in terms of their understanding of drugs and their impacts. It also provided kids with a knowledgeable resource that they could ask questions to dispel some of the myths they're hearing among their peer groups. And it kind of united kids in a commitment to living drug-free. Obviously not all kids, but it did unite large groups of kids to say, it's actually cool to not use drugs, and we're going to band together in that effort. Now, Deter had some shortcomings. Right? It completely missed the bar in that it didn't provide any kind of parental education component, which I think is very, very important when you're dealing with youth. Also didn't do much to educate teachers or staff as to what to be looking for with drugs. And to be quite maybe unfair and difficult towards the groups that put on Deter for all the right reasons, over time it just kind of failed to keep up with trends and to remain relevant. As the drug landscape changed rapidly, I don't think that Deter changed as fast as it needed to. Additionally, similar to the old Mothers Against Drunk Driving approach, it really was a fear-based approach. The whole theory was to basically tell kids, if you use drugs, you're going to die, and hopefully that would stop them from using drugs. And while that obviously can often be true, I think that the fear-based approach often in that age group is just kind of lost. They don't seem like real-world consequences. And so the bottom line is that the police department wants to help. We want to step in and fill some of that void, and we want to feel that we're having an impact in the community on this drug problem beyond just the fact that we're making arrests and referring people into drug and diversion programs. It seems like we need to get to them much sooner and kind of fill that void that was left when Deter stepped out of the community. We want to leverage what worked with Deter, and we want to improve upon what did not work. There's actually quite a bit of literature and sort of post-mortem studies on the Deter program and what was effective and what wasn't, and what maybe was not in keeping with more modern theories of psychology and sociology that need to be incorporated in such a program. And so we want to learn from those things and actually make something that is better and more effective than Deter was. And we want to do that largely by moving from an entirely fear-based education to a reality-based education system. And so this births the reducing the impact of drugs on families. Let's get rid of this epidemic is the thought process we're moving forward with. So key components of the program that we had identified. One is figuring out the age group that we need to get in front of. Very important for that age group to be young enough to be influenced and open, but old enough to understand what we are conveying to them, and for it to be relevant near enough in the future that it's not lost by the time they have to use the information we are equipping them with to make decisions. We want the information to be relevant, accurate, and contemporary. And this is one of the reasons why I think that it's very appropriate to have police officers conducting a program like this. There's no one, there are very few people, I should say, that are truly as on the front lines of this epidemic as the police are. We're seeing changes literally day by day as they're emerging, new trends in how drugs are used, trends in where they're being used, how they're being combined. Even when bad drugs are on the street, we're sort of the tip of the spear in seeing and responding to those things. We want it, again, to be less fear-based, more believable real-world repercussions. As you may know, we've had a lot of success with our Deter Program, which is also a program written by the San Bruno Police Department years ago. It's conducted every year at Cappuccino High School. It's designed to expose students to the potential repercussions of drinking and driving, but takes this much more rational, real-world approach rather than simply telling kids if you drink or drive, you're going to die in a car accident. And it doesn't take long in the teenage world to dispel that sort of myth when you watch people who drink and drive and they don't seem to have the outcome. And so our approach with Deter was to say, let's talk about the more real-world repercussions. Let's talk about all the forces at work to create consequences for driving under the influence, and hopefully have a greater impact. And I think I can safely say that in partnership with MAD, we have done so in that regard. So we're going to bring that to this program. It's key that it be relationship and trust building. We want to build on our school resource officer program by creating both group and individual interactions between the facilitators of the program and the students, the teachers, and the parents. So that when something comes and hits close to home, they do feel there's a person, not just an entity like the police department, but an actual person they know that they can reach out to and confide in and trust to give them answers and to help them navigate through it. We think it's critical to include parental education as a component, both with and without their kids. I think that it's important for the parents to be present sometimes to know some of the questions the kids are asking and to hear that side of the input, but also important for parents to be able to ask questions they may not ask in front of their kids for fear of looking like they know even less than most of us actually do. And so I think that having both those components will be important. Also incorporating teacher-staff education, because all too often that's sort of where these things rear their ugly heads first. I could give you countless examples of how our first knowledge of youth involved in drug use comes through the school system, and I think the better equipped and educated that staff is as to what to look for, the better off we all are in that early identification component. And then, of course, like any good program, it needs to include mechanisms for feedback, evaluation, adjustment, and growth. We need to be flexible and make sure that the program is serving its needs. So where are we at with this so far? I know in the retreat I reported on this briefly, but I'll recover it here just to kind of give you an idea where we're at. We're currently in stage 1. This is training staff members to deliver the program to the schools. This is developing the curriculum by looking at past DARE curriculum again, where it was strong, where it fell short, and drafting up our own curriculum. And then this is also in acquiring drug and paraphernalia displays. I know that my own experience with DARE, one of the things that was most valuable is having the opportunity to actually see drugs and paraphernalia, what they look like. So if I'm at a party, someone's using something, I don't know what it is, well, maybe now I have this education of having seen it before to know that it's something dangerous. And so we actually have to put in some effort to put those displays together, right? We don't just take drugs out of evidence. We have to communicate with the DEA and acquire these items in an acceptable format and in a secure place that we can then share them when appropriate and have them be secure when not. Stage 2 should kick in about June. That should be when we are finalizing our curriculum, beginning to put through some dry runs with our instructors and some students, and beginning to schedule directly with the schools the actual class time that will be needed to put on the program. Stage 3, we're shooting for about September, where we are beginning to promote the program thoroughly through the school district and should actually begin conducting programs with the first half of elementary schools in the San Bruno Park School District. And stage 4 should kick in December, where we will continue promoting the program. We should begin the second half implementation with the second half of the schools and really be aggressive in obtaining feedback. During that time, we'll also need to be doing some grant reporting because, as is so often the case, the San Bruno Community Foundation has stepped up to help us get this pilot program off the ground and see what we can do with it. They've awarded us a $15,000 grant to help us get started and to kind of develop the pilot and see where we can go from there. So that concludes my report on where we're currently at with the RIDOF program, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions from colleagues? Councilmember Medina.
Yes. A couple questions and comments. I think this is great. Just trying to go back to when I was younger and just the mystery and the education I got from my mom is if you did anything, you were going to die. And so that kind of was effective for a while. So is this program already approved for all of the schools in San Bruno, whether it be San Bruno Park, Cappuccino, St. Roberts, Stratford? How widespread are we going to try to do this here in San Bruno?
Chief, please feel free to answer it well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So initially, the target age group that seems to be most appropriate from our research is 5th grade students, which would isolate it to the elementary schools. We do have a letter of endorsement from the San Bruno Park School District to conduct the course in all 5th grade classes.
And it's not going to the high schools. This is a 5th grade target. Is that correct?
For the pilot program, yes, sir. That would be where we would start, of course, with, being willing to expand and adjust as appropriate.
Is it being offered to St. Robert's?
The program will be offered to every 5th grade class in the city of San Bruno. We don't yet have endorsement from the private schools, but we have had conversations there, and I would anticipate some eagerness to participate.
Sure, and this is the pilot, so I think this is great, so I fully support it. Thank you.
Councilmember Hamilton.
So no questions, just comments of support and of thanks. I mean, it was really important to step into that void left by DARE, but also to address where that program wasn't so great. It was great in many ways, but it's especially that the parent education component that was always a glaring omission. And I know that from my own experience with my kids and having to go figure all that stuff out in order to teach them. So I'm really supportive of this, and I'm thankful to the Community Foundation for providing the money to get it off the ground. Thank you, and thank you for all your hard work on this.
Vice Mayor Mason.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. This was an item that the chief and I first discussed when you first became chief and I had first been elected. So I'm really thrilled to see this come to fruition, and I'm hoping that you will get a positive response from the schools, because I think often there's a misnomer that these things just happen in public schools. And having attended both public and private school, I can honestly say that it happens everywhere. And I really do hope that the schools in San Bruno are receptive, and that this program is seen as successful. We won't know for years to come, but I wish you the best, and let us know how we can support the program. Thank you.
Chief, thank you for the presentation to the department. I know you're one person, and obviously it's a team effort. So thank you to everyone, and as was indicated, to the Community Foundation for giving us this opportunity. With that, we'll move on to item D, receive report on police radio encryption and infrastructure project. We have two presenters, and as council, as you know, we are now surpassing, we're going past 7 o'clock. So what I do want to do is go back before I get stopped and see if there was anyone who wanted to speak from the public in regards to the reducing the impact of drug on families pilot program. Seeing none, I've already announced item D, and just as a heads up, obviously we're going to continue on this, and then we will. Please.
Very quickly, Mayor, sorry. If there's a public comment for the closed session, can a member of staff go over there and just make sure there aren't any public waiting to do public comment over there?
Through the mayor, we won't be able to do that because that Zoom link is set up through my account here, which means that if I leave to go do that, I can't start it while there's a meeting happening.
Okay, I was concerned if people dialed in for public comment for the closed session at 7, that they would just be sitting waiting over there.
Council, that is a concern of mine as well. But we have one more item. I think I'd like to see if we can get through this. Or colleagues, does anybody want to do this as a collaborative effort? So, do we want
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Perhaps we can take a recess here and then go to the other site, take that comment or no comment, and then come back. Can we do that?
I can't guarantee that by ending this meeting that the link will still be open once we end the meeting right now and start a new one. And then I don't know if this link will still be active. It may, but I don't know.
So folks,
I think it would if you clicked end, but if we all left, leave meeting versus end meeting are different.
City Manager.
Thank you. I think given where we are, this is sort of the hiccups of Zoom, right? Because the meetings are virtual and people can attend virtually. I do understand the technical challenge we're in, which is this Zoom account, the city clerk's Zoom account prior meeting and we can't have two active at the same time, that is likely a technical issue that we can resolve in the future. I will say that it is totally appropriate and legal to continue with this meeting and then start the next meeting later. And, you know, pre-COVID, that happened all the time, and it happens in cities often where your meeting time runs long and you begin your closed session later because your regular meeting runs long. And we would typically have closed sessions that are agendized or after the council meeting, whenever that is. And so I think given the amount of workload that's on our plate and the need for this special meeting to sort of dive down deeply, my recommendation would be continue with this last topic, and then we'll go to closed session.
In my understanding is from the city attorney, this is as well just what the city manager stated, and we've had an officer also sitting through this meeting, and I want to give that respect to not only to our chief, but the officer for the effort and the time that they put in and waiting patiently. So, Chief, I will ask you if you could please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Council, for being patient, letting us get through all this material. This presentation was going to be delivered by a far more knowledgeable source in Captain Jeremy Brandenburg. He is unfortunately ill, and now you're going to have to watch my bobbling head again for a few minutes. But I am joined by Detective Oliver Wright, who, as you're going to learn through my presentation, is quite frankly the expert in this space. He has already saved the city and the department a tremendous amount of headache and a tremendous amount of money because he is an expert in radio technology and has saved us the need to hire a consultant to come in and figure out what we need to do with this extremely challenging requirement. And so Oliver is not planning to present, but he's here because there may be questions you have or items that I'm incorrect about, and he is far more knowledgeable. So please bear with me. But I am here to provide you with a presentation on the Police Radio Encryption and Infrastructure Project. That is the objective. In terms of the agenda, I'll give some background as to why you're having to hear about this now, describe some of the issues with our current radios and infrastructure, talk a little bit about the importance of this decision as it pertains to the long-term future. This is, in my opinion, one of those times where, as leaders, we have to really think well ahead of our own times here, or we could be setting up the folks that will succeed all of us in a very difficult situation, and I'll explain that in greater detail. I want to talk about the components of what my experts here have identified as a viable solution to the problems being presented to us, and talk about the anticipated fiscal impact, which is significant, as you have noted probably from the staff report. So in the background section here, I'm going to talk a little bit about public safety interoperability. This means the ability for different public safety agencies to communicate effectively during emergencies. I'm going to talk about the bill that basically said they can take away and are in fact probably planning to take away our existing frequency band that we use to talk on our police radios. Probably more importantly, I'm going to talk about encryption law, or what was a mandate from DOJ that we encrypt all of our radio transmissions, and why that is really the impetus for this conversation. And then a little bit about other legislation and reports that are requiring improvements to our existing systems. So we can start actually all the way back with 9/11. There was a commission report that resulted in an after action to Congress. It identified several points of improvement, and among those were communications problems that occurred during the 9/11 tragedy, and the importance of communications interoperability, similar, to any large-scale incident, but probably, on a greater scale than any we had seen before or after. You had many different entities responding to try and help people in this horrible situation. And the reality is, most of them couldn't speak to one another via their communication channels to coordinate their efforts. And it is thoroughly documented in that report that, quite frankly, there were many lives lost, most of them among public safety responders, because of this issue. There was intelligence possessed by certain groups that couldn't get to other groups because of the lack of interoperability. And what's really crazy about that is that issue absolutely still exists here in California, and it definitely exists here in San Mateo County more than 20 years after that report was issued telling us we needed to fix this. So a little bit opportunistic, I suppose, but I am utilizing this opportunity that has come through this new legislation to push to fix that issue once and for all. Currently, our police radio spectrum, which is in the 400 megahertz, I promise I'm going to try really hard not to use technical lingo that I don't really understand anyway, but that is what is used by a multitude of different entities. It's not just public safety. This same band or spectrum is used by cellular companies, private radio systems, tow companies, ambulance companies, there's a lot of people crammed into this 400 megahertz space. And in a metropolitan area like this, or a mid-urban sprawl, this creates major crowding, and that means difficulty getting your transmissions through. And we're going to talk a little bit tonight about how in my world, in our world, just one radio transmission loss can literally be the difference between life and death. And so when we're stuck in this 400 megahertz space, it creates a problem. If we were in a more rural space where there's not a lot of competition for that spectrum, we'd be in better shape. But because we're where we're at, and we're competing with a lot of different entities and agencies, the 400 megahertz is problematic. In response to this, the FCC actually designated a part of the 800 megahertz spectrum specifically for public safety, not to be intruded upon by any other entities. This was absolutely to make sure that communications would be solid when needed among public safety entities, and all you had to do to get there was get on the 800 megahertz spectrum. We still have not done that. We are on the 400 megahertz spectrum. Most agencies across the country migrated to the 800 megahertz as soon as that recommendation or shortly after was made by the FCC and the dedication was in place. It's just one of the few areas we tend to be ahead of the curve here, and for some reason we have stayed behind the curve. And it's not just San Bruno, it's really the entire county. So the police department currently uses land-based mobile radio systems. So LMR is how I'll refer to it here. And it's licensed through the FCC on the 400 megahertz T-band. So another issue we're encountering is there was legislation passed quite some time ago that made it very clear to those of us on the 400 megahertz T-band that our frequencies were likely to be sold off because they are very, very valuable to cellular providers and for-profit organizations. And we were given that notice many, many years ago, but it hasn't happened, and so we've just kind of continued rolling the dice, staying on the 400 megahertz, when in reality, while it's currently okay to be there clearly because we've done it for years, that could change tomorrow. The FCC could say, yeah, it's too valuable. You know, T-Mobile is willing to pay $1 billion for this frequency that you're currently using, or this megahertz band that you're using, and you no longer can use it. And then we would have to make a change, lickety-split right here and now, lose our ability to communicate. So there's also this issue that is playing into what we need to do here. And then bring encryption law. In October of 2020, the Department of Justice issued a mandate that all law enforcement agencies have to encrypt all of our radio transmissions that include PII. This is personal identification information or identifying data. And it's very clear why this is important, right? If you don't encrypt your radio frequency, anyone with a scanner or receiver can listen to it. And we are transmitting a lot of sensitive information about people. Names, birth dates, driver's license numbers, criminal histories, you name it, it's coming through that radio frequency. So if you don't encrypt it, really, again, anyone out there can be listening to it, using it for malpurposes, who knows? And it clearly should be protected. So while it created a lot of logistics issues for us, I would say that overall as a law enforcement executive, I certainly understand and am in support of the mandate that DOJ issued. They were aware of the potential operational impacts this would create, and so they asked all agencies to draft a plan for becoming compliant. And most of the agencies in San Mateo County got together and asked DOJ for 3 years. As you can see, we're now coming up on that, right? October 2020, now we're coming to October 2023 would be kind of that deadline point. As you're going to learn subsequent slides, what we've quickly learned is just as everyone is dealing with delays in obtaining equipment and getting services conducted, this means that if we're being told by vendors, if we don't move in the next 6 months, we will not meet the deadline, which means we will be in violation of the DOJ mandate to encrypt PII data on our radio frequencies. So what does radio encryption do? Again, it's really about privacy. It prevents anyone without the proper key or a password from intercepting our radio traffic and hearing that personal identifying information over the radio. So it protects it from being heard and then protects it from being used. It allows us operationally to continue communicating that essential data over a radio, which we need to be able to do to be compliant. I mean, you can imagine just being on a traffic stop and not being able to find out whether or not the person's driver's license is valid because you're not encrypting data would be crippling to police operations. So we need to encrypt not only for the purpose of protecting the public, but in order to comply with needing to continue using the radio. So our staff undertook a project to examine our current radio system and whether or not it could accommodate all of the needs I put before you here. Could we accommodate the encryption mandate? What would happen if we lost the 400 megahertz band? What is we have a number of current issues with coverage, which I'm going to show you some maps and talk about briefly here that is crippling to operations on a regular basis. And then how do we prepare for the future of public safety communications? Because quite frankly, not too many years ago, you were asked to put some funds forward to fix a lot of radio infrastructure issues. And honestly, if we had been forward-thinking enough at the time, that money should have been invested towards this project, because it wasn't hard to see that this is where technology is going. I will not make that mistake, I promise you that. What I'm going to bring before you here and in subsequent meetings is what I think we need to ensure that we're ready for all the next steps so that we're not wasting valuable resources. So currently we have 7 sites with radio equipment in order to make sure our radios work. This isn't terribly relevant, but they're located at Sign Hill in South City, at the Police Department, at City Hall, on Arbor Court, at El Crystal School, at the old Crestmore High School site, and at Skyline College. So as you can imagine, right out of the gate, we are looking at losing the El Crystal School site because there's no longer an El Crystal School, and there's also no longer Crestmore High School, and with the sale of the property up there, we could potentially lose those sites. So coverage issues that are already bad are about to get much, much worse. My hope here is to illustrate to you that even if we didn't move forward with encryption and these requirements weren't before us, we would be looking at significant reinvestment in infrastructure just to keep our existing program working. So to communicate with these different sites, some of the equipment we use are portable radios that we wear on our person. I'm sure you all have seen those. There are mobile radios in all of our vehicles that are mounted in there. And then, of course, there's all the dispatch console radio equipment so that dispatch can communicate with us. Talking about the issues with our current radio infrastructure, I'm just going to try to be really straightforward in this first meeting because the point here is to kind of introduce to you what we've been working through. The bottom line is our existing equipment cannot comply with the encryption mandate, period. We cannot use our existing equipment and comply with the law. This is true of both our site and our mobile/portable devices. They're incapable of encryption in their current state. Compliance would require major upgrades and equipment replacement even to the existing infrastructure. We estimate right now that just to even stay status quo and comply with the encryption alone, not accommodating the 4 megahertz issues, the coverage issues, the interoperability issues that we're talking about tonight, we would already be looking at about $1.5 million. And this is a solution that ignores all of the other issues that are likely to make that investment obsolete in the very near future. This is a map that is a little bit difficult to read that shows our current coverage in the city of San Bruno. So where you see the dark forest green are areas where we have adequate radio coverage. Adequate radio coverage is the minimum standard required. Okay, that means that when a police officer pushes the button on their radio, they will be able to communicate with dispatch, communicate an emergency, route in resources, make sure everyone knows what's actually going on. Light green is bad. Right? Light green means that if you are in a building or you are behind a hill or even behind a large tree, your radio transmission is probably not getting through. And if it does get through, it will probably be broken. Yellow is the next level of bad, where your radio might work even if you are outside, and white means no radio coverage whatsoever. So all of these white areas you see mean that a police officer there who is in a dire emergency pushes the button on his radio and no one is going to hear what they have to say. So we're trying to resolve this issue while taking on the other issues before us. I'm hopeful that sound will come through. Maybe I'll play this first one, and Mr. Mayor, if you're kind enough to indicate to me if you all are able to hear it, but these are just some really quick examples of some radio difficulties we've been dealing with. I'm pretty good at listening to radio traffic. I have no idea what is being said in that communication. So you hear the dispatcher there, that's what it should sound like for everybody, but as soon as you're on the portable radio, the officer at the beginning is what the dispatcher is actually hearing. And the code you hear feeding back is 10-1. 10-1 is a code and no officer wants to hear because it means that no one can understand you. And in this case, you're communicating something relatively innocuous. I have been in situations, in fact, one in San Diego that ended up very badly, nearly killing a police officer, where he was cueing his microphone and asking for help many times over, and no one could hear what he was saying, and no one knew where he was. So he was alone for the better part of 40 minutes while we searched an entire subdivision trying to find him. So you get the idea that the radio coverage is already problematic. We have no failback coverage. So when the existing infrastructure isn't working properly with repeaters to get radio traffic through, there's no fallback position. You're just stuck with what you've got. providers, so we don't have to listen to all of those. So then interoperability is the other big issue. And this is all about that 9/11 report and needing to communicate with one another. As part of our mutual aid requirements, as you guys know very well, we end up in other jurisdictions all the time for large-scale incidents. These are just a few recent examples of deployments of San Bruno police officers to other jurisdictions where their radios don't work, where they're unable to communicate with that jurisdiction about what's going on. I can tell you that a number of years back, I went up to the Lake County fires and was serving there, which is scary for a police officer to begin with because we don't really know how to fight fires or stay safe in fires. And while facilitating evacuations by myself, I have no way to communicate whatsoever with the local fire or police department, in that case the sheriff's office there, to know what's going on. Am I still in a safe zone for evacuations? Do I need to evacuate? It's really problematic, and we need to resolve this interoperability issue sooner rather than later. Furthermore, there is a California mutual aid, a series of California mutual aid channels set up to ensure that when we have that very large-scale incident, that earthquake, that tsunami, that massive fire, that all can communicate, and our radios do not work because we have not gotten to the level where we can support that infrastructure. And then we have this issue with the poor condition of our current radio sites. Radio sites are one of those things that as a police department, we don't really go pay attention to until you have to, right? You go look when something doesn't work. In this case, we went and looked because we're trying to assess our current infrastructure and what the cost will be of deploying a new program, and it was very, very disturbing what we uncovered. First of all, there is no redundant power at any of our sites. So if PG&E power goes down, and as we all know, that happens a lot here, we will not have that site working. If PG&E power goes down over a large area, we may have multiple sites not working and have no radio coverage. Now, if power went out because of an emergency, now we're really in trouble because we need to manage the emergency, and because we have no power, we have no radio. And even though we have backup generators at the police department, it won't do any good for the radio if they're not in those buildings. Two of them, as I mentioned before, are in buildings that are scheduled for demolition, and those are not being maintained at all. And data connections to that radio equipment is inferior at one of the sites, and at all the other sites, it's a single point. So if the data connection goes down, same effect as losing power, we would lose our ability to use that site. This is a picture of two of the radio sites as we found them when we went out and explored them on our own. Quite frankly, I think that the existing vendor is being negligent. I don't know how else to really put it. There was flood damage at both locations. There were wires hanging out exposed that, if cut, would compromise the ability for the system to work. Really just completely unacceptable infrastructure. And our current infrastructure lacks critical functions that are part of the future of radio functionality. LTE functionality is really, really important. First of all, LTE infrastructure is far more broad than any radio infrastructure we could possibly build here. And you can operate police radios on the LTE platform, which means that initially, at least, it can be as backup, so that if the radio isn't working on its existing radio infrastructure, it can kick over to the LTE platform and ensure that transmissions get through. As you'll learn in a couple of slides, what I think is more important is we've been put on notice from the FCC that probably all radio transmission for public safety will be moving to LTE-based in the immediate future, which means the more money we spend investing in our current infrastructure, the more money we'll be throwing down the trash when that change happens. Our current radios also have no GPS location. So if you're in an emergency, when you're fighting with someone or you're shot and you cannot speak into the radio, you have no way to tell people where you are. New radios will have GPS functionality that will immediately tell us exactly where you are so that we can go help officers and get where we need to be. We also have almost no available secondary channels, and this is something we need all the time, right? If we're running a DUI checkpoint or the Posey Parade or some kind of special detail, we can't have all that radio traffic on the primary frequency where there's emergency calls for service being dispatched. Right now, we're at the mercy of county communications to call and beg that we use one of their TAC frequencies. The infrastructure I'm going to suggest to you this evening would allow us basically unlimited second channels for all of those details whenever we needed them. It would include failovers, as I mentioned, with LTA functionality, and it would solve the interoperability issues. We do also have some FCC licensing concerns. This existing vendor has set up our current license to be registered in the center of Colma, which I know makes zero sense as I speak to you this evening, but the reason behind it is it was a temporary fix when the theater building was built and blocked our local PD transmitter from our radios. And so we had to relocate it, but this now has that system communicating with the Sign Hill repeater, and that's not really how it was designed to work with the rest of the infrastructure in the city. So it has further compromised the functionality, and it really makes our license kind of invalid. and it needs to be updated. Furthermore, a single channel license is no longer adequate. We are too busy of a police department. If we have 2 emergency operations going on at once, which happens on a weekly basis, we need to be able to take those to multiple frequencies so that we can preserve those communications properly for now and the future, and we do not have that ability. So I talked about projecting into the future, and this is where I get to throw out a sports analogy, which is always one of my favorite things to do, right? I love the Wayne Gretzky quote when he was asked about what made him such a great hockey player. He said that he skates to where the puck is going to be, not to where it has been. And this is one of those situations where we can choose to skate to where the puck is now and just focus on encryption alone and making sure we're compliant, or we can say, look, if we're going to invest significant money in getting encrypted, which is what we have to do, maybe we should look at deploying some solutions that might last for the long haul so I don't have another chief coming to me in a few years asking for millions of dollars more. And so that's kind of where this comes from. I think it's important to stop our continued investment in the outdated technology. The need to migrate to LTE is very important, to have LTE-capable radios so that if we move to all LTE, there's no big change for us. Again, the 400 megahertz band is likely to be sold off. We need more effective remote operation, which is what we've learned from COVID. And the radio solution I'm going to be proposing to you today would literally allow me to hear and speak on my radio from 4 counties over from here. Our detectives could go to Sacramento to serve a warrant. They'd still be able to talk to our dispatchers, listen to our radio, communicate with our folks. So being able to remotely operate is really important in this new age. And then, of course, the mutual aid communications problem needs to be solved as well. So the components of a viable solution is what I'm going to cover now. Just kind of going through what I think need to be the key components of what we deploy from here. The first is adequate day-to-day LMR coverage. Showed you the map. The bottom line is it's absolutely not acceptable in my eyes as a police executive. We need to move to roaming coverage, not conventional coverage. And what that means is a system that will communicate with the nearest infrastructure site available to it, instead of simply always communicating with the same site, even as you move further and further away from that site and compromise the quality of your communications. We need to be able to access all mutual aid channels. This requires us to deploy a multi-band, portable, and mobile vehicle radio that can communicate on any public safety radio channel. So even if some entities choose to stay on the 400, we will be able to communicate with them going to 800. If you stay on 400 and agencies go to 800, you will, in most solutions, not be able to communicate with them at all. So we need multi-band, and we need to be able to function outside of our siloed coverage area here in San Bruno. Of course, because of the mandate, we need P25 256-bit encryption capabilities. This is required in order to comply with DOJ. It would allow for other agencies to communicate with us if we provide them the encryption keys to come on our frequency. It would allow mobile and portable radios to continue communicating that PII data that is so essential for us to communicate. This does require updating encryption keys as they change. And we have a solution that would allow us to do that remotely, as opposed to having to literally take, in the current system, if we encrypt, we would have to bring every radio into the station and hand program it, reprogram it every time those encryption keys change. And they have to change frequently to be in compliance with the mandate. We need failback areas for the areas where we have reduced or no coverage. We talked about LTE providing that failback. We need to make sure we can transmit even when we leave the city. If you get in a pursuit and you quickly leave the city of San Bruno, you still need to be able to communicate on the radio. And that's what happens in all pursuits, and so we do need a solution that will provide that capability. And then we need vehicle repeaters to increase building penetration. One of the classic examples that we bring up all the time with both us and the fire department is that if you go into any of these large apartment buildings across from Tanforan, the crossings complexes, the radios don't work. Period. They don't work. So if you're in a apartment over there and you get into a bad incident or you need medical help or you need whatever, we cannot communicate that using your radio in the current structure. So we're exploring including little repeaters that go into vehicles. So instead of having your radio need to communicate with a tower somewhere in the city when you're inside of that building, it would just communicate outside to your vehicle that would then amplify the signal and send it to the infrastructure it needs to go to. We also need to increase our communication capabilities. I mentioned that this will allow us to create additional talk channels. It will allow us to create an unlimited number of additional channels. So if we're running an EOC operation, as we've been doing for almost 2 years now with COVID, we can stand up a frequency to use just for EOC communications. Investigators, detectives can stand up their own channel to deal with their communications. multiple operations at once, DUI checkpoints, whatever we're doing, we can stand up a dedicated channel to keep those communications clean and off of our primary frequency. Again, we need GPS location. I think I probably belabored that enough, but knowing where a cop is really, really important to safety. And we need reinforced radio sites with redundant electrical and data connections. Again, I don't think it's acceptable that if we lose power or we lose data, we simply can't communicate with police radios. Those are the first things that are likely to go down in a large-scale incident. So if as soon as those things go down, you lose your ability to communicate, you also lose your ability to effectively manage the emergency. So let's talk about the real difficult task here, which is the anticipated fiscal impact. We've been working very hard, as you can see from this presentation, to identify all of the potential needs and items for this project and to look at how we can do it as efficiently and effectively as possible. And that continues to this date. So I won't have all of the answers on the fiscal impact because we're still analyzing as we speak. We have multiple vendors providing multiple different solution models to try to figure out how do we solve all the problems in the most cost-effective method possible. It involves all kinds of other entities, including county communications, and so it's been a difficult undertaking. The current projected cost to address all of the deficient areas I've talked about tonight in the system looks at about between $3 and $5 million in one-time expenditures. Additionally, it will necessitate an ongoing licensing fees somewhere in the neighborhood of $150,000 to $250,000 per year. That number actually can vary really significantly depending upon whether we're building our own infrastructure to operate on or we're paying to operate on somebody else's. So there is a lot of mobility here, and we've received some good news in the last week or so from one of the vendors that there is actually a methodology that can be utilized to really significantly bring this down. But I'm trying to give council sort of the worst case scenario so that we can begin planning for what it's entirely possible this will cost. I think it is important to note that there is some funding available here. I anticipated this being an issue and knew it would be costly. I didn't know it would be this costly until we got into the analysis. We have about $700,000 in one-time revenues that the PD has been holding rather than spending to allocate it towards this project. I do acknowledge that's a small dent in something of this size, but certainly will help. We have also saved approximately $250,000 in consulting fees because of the work of Jeremy Brandenburg, a captain here at the police department, and Oliver Reich, a detective. Other agencies have paid consultants to do the work that they've done, and they have paid upwards of this amount of money. There is currently no government funding source available, which is obviously a little interesting because it comes via government mandate. And so we were hopeful that shortly after the mandate came out, there would be some discussion about funding resources that might be available to municipalities to offset this huge hit, but there still has been nothing. We are continuing to monitor that situation very aggressively, including at the county chief's level. We had a meeting with the senator's office this past 2 weeks ago to discuss, is there anything coming in the way of funding? Because we're up against the deadline now. We need to make moves, and money is not immediately available. There are also potential leasing options through the vendors that would allow us to break up this big one-time payment over several years. There are a couple of scenarios in which I will actually probably end up having staff recommend that to you all, because it can also provide some benefits in terms of the lack of need to maintain that equipment if you're leasing it versus owning it. So that is my extremely long-winded presentation. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm happy to field your questions, although I may defer many of them to Detective Reich as he is more knowledgeable, as I said tonight.
Thank you very much, Chief and Detective. Thank you for being here. First, I want to just go and see if there's any folks in the public that may wish to speak since this has gone past, just to give that opportunity first. If there's anybody from the audience that wishes to speak, if you could raise your virtual hand now. Seeing none, let's bring it to council for questions, please. Councilmember Salazar.
Thank you. Great presentation. Really interesting to see what's going on with the technology and with the regulations. And I was wondering, so I was involved a little bit when the county first started looking at FirstNet, and so that is a commercial solution, right? So we would be leveraging commercial infrastructure to relay the signal. So would the solution that we're looking at leverage other non-commercial towers in addition to the LTE, or would we be exclusively on the commercial system?
Detective, or yeah, I could tell by the chief, the grin. Detective, please feel free.
Hello, Mayor and council members, Vice Mayor. Yes and no to your question. So the benefit about FirstNet was that it was a program, a basically bid that was put out by the federal government around the 2000s, post 9/11, to create a more robust public safety infrastructure backup or failover compared to radio technology, utilizing cell phone technology, and basically allowing public safety, police, fire, even city types of like public works and such, if they had the type of equipment, to take advantage of a cell tower that might be in the vicinity of their equipment and specific channels allocated for public safety. So, for example, if a firefighter was near a FirstNet tower and had equipment that was compatible, which ours is not, the cell phone tower, if it is still working on backup battery like most of the ones around us do, it would be able to grab that transmission from that firefighter and push it through to where it would need to go. And it would actually kick off in the event of a major earthquake, or even some of the smaller ones we've had where everybody goes on their phone and ends up overloading a cell phone tower. It would actually make that firefighter's transmission priority over everybody else's. So that's what the FirstNet system was designed to fix. Definitely in the research that we've conducted and the people that I've talked to regarding using FirstNet as a day-to-day solution for public safety transmissions, it's not robust enough yet. And AT&T was awarded that contract. They fought with Verizon and T-Mobile. They ended up winning it, so now they're the ones that are out there maintaining the equipment and attempting to make that infrastructure good enough for day-to-day communication. In my experience, I would say it wouldn't be good enough for day-to-day communication. However, as a fallback, I can tell you there are plenty of places where I haven't been able to talk to my dispatch or my coworkers at the fire department on this, but my phone has worked. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the urban environment that we live in with the sprawl, the concrete buildings, the rate these buildings are going up is definitely not keeping up with, or our infrastructure is not keeping up with the way our area is being developed.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks. And another question I had was, with the requirement of moving everybody from the 400 megahertz to 800 megahertz, the higher frequencies tend to attenuate faster through going through walls. And so is that going to create a bigger problem in terms of that reception when you're inside a building? And will the vehicle, I forget what the word was, but basically your signal extenders, is that going to be able to compensate not only for where we're already deficient, but in forcing those other frequencies? It seems like it would get worse rather than better.
That's exactly what I thought towards the beginning of this project, and then I ended up consulting with public safety radio managers from other counties and other radio experts, and then we ended up doing some tests ourselves with borrowing equipment from vendors. And the funny part, I learned, and the answer was in front of me the entire time, was cell phone technology actually operates just above 800 megahertz, or just above the spectrum set aside for public safety before and after. So the reason why the cell phone companies went all crazy going after those frequencies back in the 2000s to create LTE, 3G first and LTE, was because those particular waves, while they're smaller, actually penetrate windows and concrete better than the longer waves of the older technology like the 400 megahertz or the lower bands that, like, say, Santa Cruz is on and the Highway Patrol is on, which is fantastic when you're trying to transmit over longer distances to reach out towards a tower at, like, a distant mountaintop. But once we are in this sprawl of concrete buildings, wood buildings, and the need for having additional infrastructure, 800 megahertz actually has worked. When you key up that radio on 800 megahertz, it's as if you're making that call via cell phone. And as we can see, with the availability of cell phone technology and the design of these towers and covered systems, 800 megahertz actually seems to work sometimes even better than the current T-band that we're operating on. And to answer your point about the vehicle extenders, we'd be operating the vehicle extenders on a set of 800 megahertz frequencies also to ensure that we keep that continuality of building penetration, better building penetration, and just having the power of that vehicle extender. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic to be able to pull up a mobile piece of radio infrastructure to a building where you wouldn't be able to talk to regardless. Or one of the big tests that we did recently was to pull up a vehicle on the outside of one of the parking garages at the crossings and have an officer walk down into that lower garage area. We've never had radio coverage there. The fire department doesn't have radio coverage there. Having that police car just outside of that garage, we had full bars and clear radio transmissions from there, which was actually really eye-opening for us.
Okay. And then just in terms of keeping compatibility, is our fire department and the agencies that surround us, are they also watching where that puck is going, or are they going to be behind us and get cut off when they're here to help us?
I can speak for part of that question. The fire department is staying on VHF, which is called very high frequency. It's wavelengths that are a little bit longer than ours, that are just below our current. And they've been on that for the last 30 or 40 years. It works very well for them. They have had, our local fire department does have some issues with radio coverage and building penetration. But due to the way they do their operations, typically what they do is a battalion chief is outside of a building, say during an emergency, and the firefighters actually go into a building and change channels to a local, like, walkie-talkie channel. So building penetration is never as much of a big deal for them because they're their help, and they're able to talk to each other as they navigate through, like, for example, like a building at Shelter Creek. And if they need additional help, they talk to their boss who's parked outside, who is monitoring and can radio on another radio for help or for additional resources. Our operations, unfortunately, it's the way we do things, and there's no way around it because we can't have a supervisor follow everybody around it every time like the fire department does, is that officer, they're their sole help, especially if they go in somewhere by themselves. They have to maintain that connection to the outside world. And then, I'm sorry, the second question, which I believe the chief's ready to answer, would be where the puck might go, and the other agencies around us.
Yeah, thanks.
The detective has now yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will just add to that I don't actually know the answer yet, Councilmember Salazar. I'm working very hard at the county chief's level to try and share the knowledge I've been blessed with through Oliver and Jeremy's work, and to help the county as a whole to realize that really it's in your best interest to just skate to where the puck is going and to make this long-term decision. I suspect there will be at least a few agencies that do not, that choose to stay with the existing vendor for whatever reason. In many cases, it might be because it saves some money. And I think that the good news is that whatever change we make, we're going to be able to communicate on their frequencies and communicate with them and do everything we need to do. If some of those entities make the potentially wrong decision, in my view, then the one downside will be they will not be able to talk on our frequency. In most cases, we'll still be able to hear us, but they wouldn't be able to come into San Bruno and use the San Bruno frequency to communicate, which incidentally we actually don't do in this county very often anyway. Typically, for running a joint operation, we move to a joint mutual aid channel. And that's actually a separate conversation that is impacted by this decision-making process as well.
Okay. All right. Great presentation. Thank you both.
Councilmember Medina.
Yes, thank you. When I first read this report and saw the 3 to 5 million, I was just like, we cannot catch a break. We're making progress, and the reality of the changing world and an aging infrastructure and new requirements, we 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, right? But nonetheless, thank you for the reality and how we get to make things better and safer. A couple questions. This is probably for our city attorney. Can development agreements require that repeaters be installed in buildings? I thought that was kind of what we were doing back in the day with the crossings. That I remember there was a concern about that, and what can we do to make sure that when a new building goes up, that it can be properly served for the people inside and for the officers that are providing service?
The city attorney, I think I see everyone's heads are nodding, but city attorney, you have the answer.
Actually, I do recall that, and maybe the folks from the police department can remind us exactly what occurred at that point, but there are really 2 mechanisms. So since not all projects have development agreements, really the question is, can the city require that occur as a condition of approval for whatever discretionary permits are being applied? Separately, if there's a development agreement, then that would be a negotiated point. But does anyone from PD recall what we ended up doing with respect to that building? I'm sorry, I don't remember. I thought there was a provision included in the conditions of approval, but I don't recall one way or the other.
Yeah, Oliver, you might have more knowledge of the infrastructure at this point, but I will say that my understanding is that it ended up being something that just didn't work its way into the final plans, and that there are no repeaters on those buildings.
For the crossing?
The crossing.
Yeah, of course, that was quite a while ago, but that definitely is something that we want to explore. Normally the other issue is that general police services funded by the general fund are not something that we can require as a condition of land use approvals. There's sort of a variety of cases on that topic, but it's certainly something we'd want to look into and see what we could do, and we'll work collaboratively with the police department to see if there's any legal way to make that a requirement for a land use approval.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to note here is that, and I'll just say it briefly, and then if you want more elaboration, then Oliver can certainly step in, but we have a unique topography here that's making things challenging as well. So even putting repeaters on buildings, we have a perfect storm where we have a lot of undulation and obstructions to radio traffic, but we also don't have anything that's super, super high that we can put a tower on that will then communicate with radios anywhere in the city, right? Whereas like South City's got Sign Hills, so they have a lot of undulation too. They've got something that's higher and more accessible than anything else. For us, like even the Sweeney Ridge location we've uncovered has so many pockets that it can't reach because, you've got this line of sight requirement, so to speak. And so even if we did implement a solution where with every new project we were just installing repeaters all over this town, I think the consensus from Oliver and Jeremy is it wouldn't solve this problem.
And yes, elaborate on that, Councilmember Medina and City Attorney. There is a fire code. There is a fire code that I've explored with our fire inspector, Gage Slice, and he's informed me that it appears that the code has not really been enforced here in San Bruno the last 20 years. So over the last couple of years, he's been looking to rectify that. Unfortunately, the roadblock that he's encountering is going to some of these developments that have existed already the last 15, 20 years, and telling them or asking them to install something of a great price that they should have installed prior that we should have enforced. And he's working currently to fix that in regards to police, fire, and emergency medical communications. That price is traditionally taken on by the developer, not by the governing body or by the city, and that's directly required by the fire code, as far as my understanding has been via the fire department. So he is working on that, and I believe he's working on getting something together to ensure that any future developments, including any bigger developments that we may have, install more robust infrastructure to assist with our communications and not just the lowest tier that might be required.
That's definitely good news and bad news, right?
Yes, sir.
And you know, we have an older city, and we're looking at a lot of things, and so that's great that we're going to try to fix those. I'm sure their insurance company of the building would probably be very interested to know, like, why there wasn't any of those that equipment installed. Thank you for the report. I'm hoping that, you know, we could look at, you know, collaboration with the county. It seems like if all the other cities are having the same similar problem of having to make this switch, you know, San Bruno's geography, you know, is what it is, and we can kind of work with that. But I do appreciate your hard work, and I look forward to these solutions. Thank you.
We're going to go to Councilmember Hamilton, but if you don't mind, I was going to call on the city manager first to see if he had additional stuff he'd like to add.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to touch on development. I was sort of waiting for this comment because I knew someone was going to ask, how are we going to fund this? But because we were talking about development, I just wanted to point out that it is important to note that the City Council's actions to approve development impact fees can help as a funding source for this, as well as the community benefit packages that we've already negotiated with and have approved development agreements. And so the whole conversation out, repeaters are not the only solution, is totally accurate. But I just want council to note that your prior actions are likely going to provide significant funding for this important sort of must-needed infrastructure improvement that we have to undertake.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Councilmember Medina.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with that. That's a great point from our city manager. Also, this cost to the city probably wasn't included in the determination of those impact fees. So we may need to look at that and make sure that we can provide that. Correct?
You know, I actually have the final report here and was skimming it as we were talking again. I don't actually have the details in front of me. Certainly vehicles and equipment are included in the public safety side. How much for radios we can delve down deeper into, but yeah, I would say it's a safe bet that the $3 to $5 million number was not included. The high point about development impact fees is that you have to do a nexus study, and through your nexus study, you can add in additional equipment, whether you replace it or not. So,
excellent. Thank you.
Councilmember Hamilton.
So thank you very much for the presentation. One quick question about Crestmore, and I guess this is just kind of a technical question. Our current facilities and then potentially where new equipment would go, are those co-located with where the cell companies have their equipment at Crestmore, or are these facilities on the Crestmore building or elsewhere on the property?
This facility is actually on or inside the Crestmore High School building. We discovered, yes.
Got it.
So it will be going down.
It will go away. Okay, understood. Because I figured, I mean, obviously there's going to be lots of changes there, but I can't imagine the cell companies are going to give up their towers that are up there. So.
Definitely. And to add to your question there, or to kind of add to that, in this redesign, we're looking to completely eliminate reliance on private parties, including schools. We want to make sure that we place our equipment on city-owned property. We know the condition of it, that we know there's not 2 inches of water, that we know there wasn't almost fired over like was the case over in Elk Crystal without our knowledge, based on lack of information from our vendor. So that those are all contingencies that are definitely going to be put into place here if we implement this plan.
Got it. My next question is probably a silly one, but I just want to make sure that I'm understanding that this is a project that we would need to do all at once. This isn't something that we could do in phases or whatever to spread the costs out, because of the interoperability piece of it. You know, you have to have everybody on the same system. Is that the case? I just want to make sure I'm understanding that.
Go ahead, Chief.
I was just going to say that is actually something that's being considered, Councilmember Hamilton, is can there be phases? So far, it appears that it would probably end up actually costing a lot more to phase it because the different components feed into one another. But we're not done with that analysis, right? Which is why the idea tonight was just to give an overview, but that is a very, very on-point question that we would plan to bring you more info on in subsequent presentations.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. I guess the only other comment that I have is that in terms of looking for funding, I don't know if there's any, if there are other departments in the county outside of the sheriff's department, I would imagine, that are in the same boat. I mean, is it possible maybe to band together and go to the county for potentially looking for funding? Something tells me that the sheriff's department isn't going to have any problem funding any of this, but I just wonder if there's a way that the other departments can band together and maybe go to the county looking for potential funding, and how can we help with that?
So we're working very hard on that front now, and I won't go into great detail in the interest of time, but I will tell you that county, and it's not the sheriff's office, right, but county communications has already basically built the infrastructure for the system that we need to run all of this on. They need to upgrade it. There needs to be a move from phase 1 to phase 2, right, Oliver, is the terminology for them. But it exists already, and we could pay a subscription fee to go onto their system. We're trying to get that information from the new director over there, so I won't speak disparagingly about, we've been asking for that information for 2 years, but there's a new sheriff in town over there, and he's committed to trying to get us the information we need to go on that system. Beyond that, I sit, as you know, on the executive board for the County Chiefs Group, and I'm working very, very hard to get that Chiefs Group to understand that there are economies of scale here without question, even in terms of equipment. Sure. Right? Motorola and Harris vendors, their prices are going to change when you're buying the number of radios Little San Bruno needs versus the number of radios 23 municipal law enforcement agencies in the county need. So we're trying very, very hard to drive that number down through many mechanisms, including that economies of scale argument and the possibility of getting county to let us dive into that infrastructure that already exists.
Got it. Great. Thank you very much.
Vice Chair Mason.
Yeah, so a couple of comments. I think the first one is I just want to thank the PD staff for handling this in-house, similar to what I said to the fire department. I think it's greatly appreciated, not just for cost, but I've always felt that the institutional knowledge we get to keep, and it's really quite beneficial to own that information. So thank you, Oliver, and everybody else who's been working on this particular project. I just want to share out loud some of my thoughts in balancing this particular item that I'm sure will come to us at a later time for approval. And that is really balancing the argument that I think a couple of us have made as newer council members of the frustration around, for example, deferred maintenance in the city and the longevity of why it hasn't been addressed, why it hasn't been prioritized. And here you are trying to get ahead of something that other agencies in the county may not be ahead of at this time. And so it would be wonderful for Senator to be ahead of the game in this respect. But I balance that with the hours of presentations that I've sat through telling us how wonderful the SBPD responded. And I want to be clear, I'm not questioning that. I think the work that is done by our police and all police officers is amazing. But the response to such catastrophes like the YouTube shooting and the Crestmore explosion. And that was done without a command center. It was done without new vehicles that we approved last year. It was done without new guns that we approved in the last 2 months. And it was also done without what's being requested tonight. And so when I think about the presentation that was given and provided, and I think about, when you talk about kind of the darkness, it makes me think about Rollingwood, right? We've got a city who we have recently found out needs, a certain part of our city needs about $5 million of work so that they have lights that are functional and we can count on. And it's a balancing, and I think you all knew this coming into this presentation, but I just want to say that this is a really difficult position to be placed in because the information that we have been receiving has been that the PD has been skimly resourced, and I don't disagree with that, which is why this council has approved every request for the last, I believe, 2 years that has come to us. But at what point are we do we look at it and say, do we really need this year versus lights in Rollingwood, or is it something that is prioritized next year? And so I don't know where I am right now. I'm just thinking out loud, and I just want to share that that's kind of my concern and what I'm balancing out. I also want to say that I would really like to see this looked at holistically, meaning, we received a presentation from Chief DeLay recently about a grant that he received to pay for some new radios and such in his department. And because the fire and police work so closely together, and really the fire is often, and if I understand this correctly, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but also includes a number of paramedics that are the first on the scene for life safety issues. I think we should really look at this as adopting this for the entire team, right? The entire city team. And so what would that look like, and what would Chief DeLay's position be in that respect if we were to expand it to fire and police so that everybody's on the same system? And then I want to echo Councilmember Hamilton's comments around funding. And my understanding is that the Measure K funds also include public safety, and encourage you to look into what a possibility may be around Measure K funds, especially if it's something that you're piloting that the rest of the county may be interested in jumping into or onto at a later time. But I don't know that the City of San Bruno has received any funds for Measure K as it relates to public safety. And it may be something worth looking into, especially since one of our council members sits on the committee. Thank you.
Chief, and then we'll go to the detective.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just first of all, Vice Mayor Mason, that very appropriate comments, right? Like, it's why your guys' job is so unenviable, is because it's easy for me to just represent what I need for the police department, and then you have to sit there and think, there's only so much pie, and how do I cut up the pie to accommodate all of the things that need to be accomplished? So please don't think that's lost on me. I totally understand it, and I don't envy those decisions. There were just a couple of points of clarification that I wanted to make on that. One is that I honestly wouldn't be coming before you asking for these upgrades if it weren't for the mandate and the requirements by law. That is something that we don't have a choice to do, and my first inclination was to say, look, we have so much going on at the police department. I talked to Jeremy and Oliver and said, just find out what it's going to cost to just fix the encryption so we don't get in trouble. And when that number came in as high as it did, and our initial quotes from some of these vendors to fix everything else was not astronomically more than that, is when we started to explore what else we could do. And then in that process, we uncovered we were trusting a vendor for a very long time, and it's very evident that that was misplaced. And we uncovered a bunch of issues we weren't aware of that now it looks more emergent to need to fix those in the immediate. Beyond that, I'll just say that, and I really appreciate the comments that, we've handled all these incidents without all of these new additions over the past few years, and did handle them quite well. At the risk of, certainly don't diminish the work of the men and women who are here and what they do. But I can tell you that when we conduct thorough after actions in those incidents, the outcomes are good, but it doesn't mean we did the best we could have done. And I'll give you one example right at the YouTube incident where we have some 12 sworn peace officers working to respond to that. Within about the first 9 or 10 minutes, we had almost 200 on scene. And we couldn't communicate with 90% of them. And as a result, in the middle of trying to sweep a building for potential additional shooters, we had to take up almost 30 minutes of radio traffic time to have a dispatcher do a roll call for every single officer that had responded to the incident so we knew where they were, what they were doing, and could put them on our command board. And it was one of the major outcomes. Again, we were told in 2001 to fix this, and we didn't. And then here we are doing an after action 16 years later, 17 years later, and we're having the same problems because we haven't fixed what they told us to fix. So yeah, I do think we handled those scenarios pretty well. But I could also tell you at the pipeline explosion, I was a detective supervisor at the time, and I was running around in plain clothes on streets of fire with a little radio in my hand and could hear and communicate nothing. No clue what anybody was doing. And so I do think there are issues that need to be fixed, but I'm very sensitive to your comments and the fiscal challenges, which is why, you can tell by my demeanor, I'm not excited about bringing this to you all, to be perfectly honest, because it's a difficult thing to stomach. And hopefully you can trust me to know that I'm going to do everything I can to bring you potential solutions that are being as fiscally responsible and accommodating as possible and giving you some options as to how you move forward with this. Beyond that, I'd say that Oliver is way more qualified to talk about this nexus with fire. I know he spoke about it a little bit earlier, but the reality is, as closely as we work, our needs are actually very, very different when it comes to communications. Not the least of which is created by the fact that they use a county dispatching entity that we don't use, and that, if you notice, not all firefighters have radios, right? They go to an incident and they have a battalion chief and then a couple designated folks communicating on the radio. They're not using it as their minute-to-minute lifeline the way that we are. Is there more to that, Oliver? I know you've spoken to Ari and Gage quite a bit on this.
Yes, Vice Mayor Mason, you were 3 steps ahead of me with that thought. So that has actually been in place in my kind of parameters for going forward initially was how can we communicate with our fire department better? And we are limited to the fact that they operate in their own, for lack of a better term, continuality of operations. They are intertwined with county dispatch, who dispatches them. They're intertwined with South San Francisco Fire, Central County Fire, our neighboring entities for auto aid. So if Millbrae Fire is tapped out, our fire department immediately goes over there and vice versa. All those agreements are in place and they all communicate with each other. What really struck me as we went into this project, and in the interest of time, I won't get too technical and bore you guys, is the fire department and the county radio system, which is completely independent of ours, they don't have any, as far as I have discovered, any alternative ways to communicate besides the phone. No other cities have any, fire departments have any other radio channels or availability to communicate with their neighboring public safety agencies without using the county radio system. So that is, in my opinion, a negative because there's no fallback. So in the solution that we're looking at placing parameters for is actually being able to have the fire department jump onto our system in the event of a major emergency, catastrophe, or even on a day-to-day emergency, and be able to use our system to communicate with not just each other, but with us and our dispatch. And where that immediately comes into my mind is in a major earthquake or other disaster where all of these connections and data lines and fiber and Ethernet go down for the county sites, which is definitely possible. The fire department can switch to our system and continue to maintain communications and provide service to San Bruno, as we will be on an island, as I'm sure every other city will be in the immediate hours after a disaster of that kind of scale, and be able to maintain adequate communications and dispatching. So our dispatchers would actually be able to talk to our fire trucks and firefighters and direct them where they might need to go, which no other city and no other entity here in San Mateo County has that in place, unfortunately. So you definitely hit it right on the head. Having that foresight to think about something like that is something that we've been exploring. And in talking to some of my colleagues in other cities, they go, we can't do that already? Nobody's thought about it really yet until it happens. And we've been blessed the last 20 or 30 years not having, and we've had our disasters definitely, but having disasters that knock out communications and the ability for a city to provide adequate public safety services. In my historical readings, I would say maybe the last major earthquake would have been a 1989 earthquake where something like that happened. So if I can answer any more questions or provide technical feedback or anything like that, I'm always available. I'm a nerd. I love to talk radios, and you hit it right on the head with that.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll probably ask some more questions offline just to get some intricacies. But I did just want to comment on the chief's comment. It shouldn't be difficult for you to bring an item that is needed to us. It should be our difficult decision to determine how we're going to balance them. So I really do appreciate the time and effort that's been put into this and the understanding of how difficult this decision will be when budget time comes around. So I look forward to learning more about what we're talking about and how everything ties in. So thank you to everybody who worked on this.
And just to finish it up, I do want to thank Ryan, Oliver, Jeremy for the work. And obviously, it's great that you can do it in-house and that you have talented individuals. It also means those are other things that aren't getting done because their time is being spent here. And in the Detective Bureau, there's a lot for Oliver to do. So to assist our community. I appreciate that you did bring it forward. These are things we have to hear, we need to hear. One of my things is always preparedness. One of those things when I got elected was the EOC room used to be a storage room at the bottom of City Hall. And I was adamant, and it took us some time to get it brought up to speed as what it was and what it should be and what it is today. And then it was utilized during the 210 pipeline explosion. But it was because we spent the time, the money, the resources, and we were then prepared, because if not, we would have been in a big tent in the parking lot lent to us by the county is where we would have been having the emergency operations center with no bathrooms, with no kitchen with a refrigerator and being able to do what we need to do. So I do appreciate you bringing this forward. These are things we have to hear. We need to hear, and we need to know that our community and our public safety personnel, our police officers, the men and women that serve us, we give them the best tools to operate. And we have been blessed, and we have been fortunate. But again, if we're running on luck, I don't want to use luck as the guide. I want to make sure we're prepared. So with that, City Manager, is there anything else?
No, I just want to thank the council for taking the time. We know there's a lot going on, and having these detailed meetings so you can dive in is important, and I know we'll be having more over the next 6 to 12 months. So thank you for your willingness to carve out time for these. Thank you.
And then thank you to the staff for staying longer than anticipated. And just as an FYI, personal privilege, Cappuccino won their girls basketball game 58-48. They move on to the next, to round 2. So just a little news flash. That's why I couldn't be at the game, so I had to display Cappuccino to give them the support. At the last game, it was incredible how they came from behind, better than the Warriors did the other night. So with that, we will go ahead and adjourn. Council colleagues, we have another closed session. We will go to the public comment portion. Then when we go to our closed session, I'm going to ask us to take some time so people can get up, stretch, get something to drink, etc. Okay? So this meeting is adjourned, and the next regular City Council meeting will be held on March 8th